Great. That's great. I see that people are coming back in.
Yeah, hopefully we didn't lose too many. We were not able to fix it for this session, but we'll try to get it worked out for tomorrow. Again, my apologies for this.
Mr. Lallali, I see that you're back, and I think at least two of the panelists for this first session are now back with us. So I'm going to turn it over to you now to moderate this first session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Okay, I'm having the pleasure of moderating the first session of this 3 days meeting. The first session is on the ideology of terrorism and insurgency and terrorism as a response to political and socio-economic challenges in Africa. And we have three capable participants. Kicking off this discussion will be Dr. Abdurrahman Idriss, African Studies Centers in Leiden, in addition to two brilliant panelists, Dr. Cedric de Koning, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, Oslo, and Nafis Hamid, excuse me, I beg your pardon, Terrorism and Organized Crime Unit, Department of Security and Crime Science, University College, London. So before, to ensure that we'll make the most of this session, I'll dive right into the session by requesting Dr. Abdurrahman Idriss to take the floor and act as a guest speaker, or sorry, a kickoff speaker for this session. So over to you, dear colleague. Dr. Abdurrahman Idriss, I hope you're with us. So, Professor, I don't know if I can proceed with Dr. Abdurrahman. Otherwise, I can request from Dr. Cedric to dive in.
I think we should just go ahead with Dr. de Koning to
okay, wonderful.
Proceed, because you may have a different. I will confirm with Ms. Bello while in the meantime, and I'll send you a note.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Let me just look at the last agenda that was sent to me this morning. Okay, yes.
Yeah, because
let me dive into directly. I do apologize. I was reading from the previous agenda. Yes, Dr. Koning, if I kindly request you to take the floor, we'll give you about 15 minutes.
And just to be clear, Mr. Lallali, we also have Mr. James Barnett listed as a panelist, yes. And he's here.
Okay,
and
so
yeah, I believe you were looking at a previous agenda.
Indeed, yeah. I was. I beg your pardon. So, Dr. Koning, if I can ask you to take the floor. Well, what we'll do is we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes presentation, and then allow about 15 to 20 minutes Q&A session. So, Dr. Koning, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Apologies, I was just struggling to find my unmute button. Very nice to be with all of you, and especially General Ishola Williams, that I haven't seen for many years, and many other colleagues that I noticed on in the meeting. Fantastic to be with all of you in this meeting. I'm going to speak about lessons for Cabo Delgado from the African experience in Somalia. So looking at one of our, let's say, oldest or longest serving experiences to somewhat one of our newest experiences in this broad area of dealing with terrorism, insurgency, violent extremism. So what I will focus on, I've been asked in a very specific format how our presentation should be, to start with a summary. So, and we've touched on this point that it is already widely acknowledged that there is no military solution to violent extremism, as many of our speakers in the opening session has already mentioned. Yet, although this seems to be our common wisdom, most of the national, international responses that are underway, including Cabo Delgado and Sahel and Lake Chad and the other experiences that we've already touched on, do appear to be hard security driven. And so the question is, although we seem to have this knowledge, how do we escape from this hard security path dependency? And I would offer some suggestions. I would say one of the key lessons from Somalia, and of course elsewhere, is that the political governance, the development efforts should not be sequenced to follow after security has been restored. And one of the reasons I would put forward is that because it's not possible to restore security through military means alone. And therefore, having an integrated approach should be something from the beginning in terms of our design. I'll go into more detail into that as I go through the presentation. And I've been asked to share a little bit of an agenda of how I will build my argument. I will look a bit at what are the key lessons, what are the drivers of conflict, how do we escape from the hard security trap, and then go into perhaps what I suggest as potential alternative solutions or paths, the blended stabilization approach, what are the negative side effects of security first trap and how to escape from them, and then looking at the civilian stabilization alternative and issues around that. So let me start with the focus on what lessons we can learn from the Somali experience. As I mentioned in the summary, I think one of the key lessons we have learned is that although a security operation can create the opportunity for stabilization, that for that opportunity to be realized, one needs a significant focus on the political, governance, rule of law, basic service, and socio-economic development aspects of the problem, the challenge that we're dealing with. And I think this is not unique from Somalia. We see this in all the other cases. And I think the primary mistake we have made, and I think we are still continuing to make in Somalia, is that we are directing our primary effort at managing the symptom, the violent extremism or the terrorism, and not on the underlying drivers which continue to drive instability in Somalia or in the other places we look at today. And the underlying drivers of conflict in all of these places are, I think, well known. We know that it's marginalization, center-periphery tensions. I mean, Mozambique is an ideal example of that. Exclusion, poverty, underdevelopment, unemployment, weak governance, and poor basic services. And we see that in these kind of situations, there's decades of neglect in these areas that lead to a pervasive sense of hopelessness, And when a certain tipping point is crossed, some people do resort to violence, and the opportunities that the violent extremists or the terrorists, the insurgents, if you like, offer to them, for many of them offers both a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, as well as, of course, income for them and their families, an alternative form of livelihoods. So we know this is the case, but the argument very often brought forward is, yes, but we need to establish security first before we can bring governance and development. The problem is that kind of argumentation is precisely why we are trapped in this kind of hard security approach. When we give this primacy to a military solution, as we've seen in AMISOM, for instance, in Somalia, or at the moment in northern Mozambique. Very interesting at the moment is the kind of developments in Central African Republic and Mali, where there's also this notion that turning to private military companies, especially in this case, the Wagner Russian companies, can solve the problem. We know that if we focus on this military solutions, if we stop at that, or if we primarily invest in military solutions, or if we give most of our political attention to the security solutions, then it creates this focus on security. And so, for instance, we would all know about something called AMISOM, or we know about what Rwanda is doing, has achieved so far in northern Mozambique, but we are not aware of the rest of the activities that are being undertaken. Governance, peace building, development is still seen as complementary to the main security division. And one of the challenges which I will highlight is that if we do follow this approach, and if we do achieve some form of stability as a result of the security actions, then there's no incentive for the governing elites to make the transformation and the changes to address those root causes, those underlying drivers that we have mentioned, because there's no longer an incentive for them to change. So how do we escape from this hard security path? Well, as I mentioned in the summary, I think the key lesson is not to follow this sequenced approach, to understand that it's not possible to achieve security through military means alone. At best, it's creating an opportunity. And if we don't invest equally or more in the civilian, the peace building, the governance dimension, then that will be a lost opportunity. And therefore, we need to, from the beginning, plan for, design, and deploy an integrated, or at least a very well coordinated initiatives in this regard. So I mentioned that I think one of the key negative side effects of the security first approach is that, first of all, it creates a political economy of dependency. We see that the longer these missions carry on, the more there's a political economy that evolves around that, especially the current elites, who are the ones who are renting the premises and who are providing other services, find themselves in a situation where, of course, they would like that intervention to continue, and there's no incentive for them to actually find a political solution, because that would actually mean a loss of income for them. But secondly, it also creates a political dilemma, because the more the situation is successfully stabilized, the less there's an incentive for the ruling political elites to address the underlying political and socioeconomic problems that have caused the situation in the first place. And so this has led to many places in Africa and elsewhere to a kind of a no war, no peace stalemate, where we see these operations continuing for decades. Without actually addressing the underlying causes. I mean, we all have just come out of the Afghanistan experience. Most of the analysis is that is exactly what will happen in Somalia should AMISOM leave, because although AMISOM has achieved its core objectives of providing security to the government, liberating some territories militarily from Al-Shabaab, it it and the other international actors together with AMISOM has not actually addressed the drivers of conflict. And so the alternative is a civilian stabilization effort going hand in hand with the more, let's say, hard security approach, where there's a significant focus on the political engagement with the people, with civil society, community, political and traditional leaders, involving those key stakeholders in finding and addressing the solutions, not just working at the state level, who identify the problem as, terrorism and deal with that symptom, but dealing very closely with the people in these areas that are actually involved in the problem, in the situation, and the ones who experience the lack of governance and basic services and so forth. And we actually have a very good example in this case. We have the Lake Chad Basin Regional Stabilization Strategy that is underway, and that complements or is a parallel initiative to the multinational joint task force. I don't see the same kind of focused effort in the Sahel or in northern Mozambique or even in Somalia. So I think we can learn a lot from the Lake Chad Basin Regional Stabilization Strategy. Of course, that is also still underway. But I think the approach, the engagement with governors, with local civil society, focusing on those issues is very important. I'm going to, in the interest of time, just move a little bit forward and focus on two last points I want to make. The one is that I think we need to recognize that a lot of the traditional ideas we have about international conflict resolution, that international actors like the UN or even the African Union have the agency to come in from the outside, deploy an operation, for instance, in northern Mozambique, and actually help to resolve the conflict. In fact, we do not have that agency. We are perhaps able to contribute to create a moment of stability, as the Rwandan forces have done in northern Mozambique. But if the national and local actors do not act, if the right things are not being done, that moment will easily be lost. The insurgents just withdraw back into the bush. They know the Rwandan forces or the SADC forces cannot be there forever. And so they are quite patient and can easily come back, and in the meantime, continue with a kind of insurgency campaign. So the focus has to be on helping to build, and I'm saying helping because, again, we can't build the resilience of local communities and national institutions from the outside. It has to come from within. But international actors, local actors, regional actors can help to build the resilience of national and local social institutions, local capacities for peace. In my work, I have focused on a particular approach called adaptive peace building, which is an approach that recognizes the complexity of the situations we're dealing with, and therefore moves away from a kind of a linear, top-down designed approach to dealing with peace building, to rather dealing with peace building as something that has to be inductive, that has to come out of the engagement with the local stakeholders, and together with them to learn through an adaptive process about what works, what doesn't work, and continuously adapt the support the international community provides to community in that way. So to conclude, my core message is that the lessons from our African experiences in Somalia and elsewhere is to avoid getting trapped in a linear security-first counterinsurgency doctrine. And I'm afraid from my perspective, I see that this is exactly what is happening also again now in northern Mozambique. That we need to recognize that military action can create an opportunity for stabilization, but for that opportunity to be realized, one needs an equal or greater effort and attention to the politics, the governance, the justice, the socio-economic dimensions of the drivers that are causing that conflict in the first place. And therefore, our focus should be on civilian stabilization, on resilience, and perhaps on adaptive approaches rather than top-down, linear, externally expert-driven approaches to dealing with terrorism and insurgency. Thank you very much. Let me stop there and hand the screen back to our moderators. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Conning. Thank you very much. Let me just move straight into the other panelist, or to the other panelists, Mr. James Barnett, Visiting Fulbright Fellow, Institute for Africa and Diaspora Studies, UNILAG. So over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Lallali. So I'm joining this panel a bit late and have just actually been traveling up in northwestern Nigeria. I didn't have time to make a PowerPoint exclusively for this presentation, but I am going to try to share some slides from a presentation I did earlier in the month that has some slides that are relevant. So,
Mr. James, you're breaking off, so maybe a good idea would be for you to switch off the camera. Hello?
okay.
Yeah.
For Nigeria. So,
Mr. Barnett, maybe a good idea would be to switch off the camera because you're not coming through clearly.
all right, sorry about that. Let me okay, is this better? Can you all hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, great. So I guess in that case, I won't do screen sharing. That'll be too confusing. So I'll just, I'll try to talk briefly about kind of, the contribution I hope to make today, which is to talk a little bit about a conflict in Nigeria that has kind of flown under the radar internationally compared to, say, a lot of the jihadist insurgencies in Africa. And that's this conflict of banditry in northwestern Nigeria, which I think is relevant to today's discussion because while the name bandit, I think especially for a lot of, Western audiences kind of evokes images of like, kind of rogue vagabonds, petty criminality, stuff like that, highway robbery and such. Banditry in Nigeria has really kind of developed into an insurgency. And it's an insurgency that kind of defies easy characterization. And it's a rather complex phenomenon that I'll try to condense into about 10 or 15 minutes. But it's an insurgency nonetheless, and it shares some important characteristics with other insurgencies that Nigeria is presently facing, both the the jihadist conflict in the northeast with Boko Haram, or now Islamic State West Africa province, but also to an extent, other kind of proto or nascent insurgent movements. For example, the IPOB in the southeast, which is a secessionist movement. And what's interesting about the bandits is that they don't quite kind of fit into most kind of characterizations or most kind of like easy categories about how we define insurgents or how they operate. And I think that also there's a lot to be said about what the challenge of banditry shows in terms of kind of some of the challenges that the Nigerian security sector faces, and likewise the challenges that any kind of foreign intervention, whether primarily political, military, or economic, would face. And so I think Dr. Koenig's points about incentives for government elites is a very good place to start off there. So to kind of briefly just explain, northwestern Nigeria is presently facing a real onslaught from kind of criminal insurgents that go by the name of bandits. And there are over 100 of these different gangs in the Northwest, totaling over 10,000 militants total. And together they cover more area than Boko Haram holds. They're killing a tremendous amount of people. The kind of best estimate is very much a lowball estimate, and that's of 12,000 over the past decade. But in reality, it could be even twice that, according to some sources. And it's led to massive displacement of over 1 million people in the Northwest. Massive number of school children, over 1 million, are presently not in school over fears of mass kidnappings, which has become kind of one of the signature operations of some of these bandits. And it's also really driving at kind of very fragile ethno-religious divisions within Nigeria, particularly because most of the bandits are from the Fulani ethnic group, which for those who have done some research on jihadism in the Sahel, for example, know that there's often an issue with farmer-herder relations that kind of develops into an ethnic or even jihadist kind of conflict, and that the Fulani have been caught up in the middle of a lot of this in various countries. And so in Nigeria, especially now under the administration of a Fulani president, you have kind of the perennial kind of religious and geographic divisions of Nigeria are kind of being exacerbated by this notion that there's a kind of a Fulani enemy, if you will, that is trying to destabilize Nigeria. So, you know, the title of this panel, it talks about socioeconomic factors and ideology. And I guess I'll start very briefly on the question of socioeconomic factors, which is that banditry has grown from a result of farmer-herder conflict, particularly in northwestern Nigeria, where unlike, say, in parts of the Middle Belt, in most states in northwestern Nigeria, there is not actually an explicit religious dimension to farmer-herder conflict because the majority of people, both farmers and herders, are Sunni Muslim. But many of the same kind of socioeconomic conditions that contributed, for example, to the rise of Boko Haram are present in the Northwest. So low levels of education, high levels of rural poverty, particularly. And in the case of Boko Haram, the effects that rural poverty had was to drive people into the city, particularly Maiduguri in the 2000s, which made them, you know, potential kind of uprooted and in search of guidance and social cohesion, which they found in Muhammad Yusuf's movement. In the Northwest, it's kind of the inverse, or not quite the inverse, but banditry has arisen very much as a rural phenomenon where the bandits kind of provide that sense of purpose and livelihood that Boko Haram provided in the Northeast, or provides in the Northeast. But whereas Boko Haram grew from an urban movement that was largely, you know, a movement of people displaced from the countryside, banditry has really arisen as a result of, you know, people who remain pastoralists and have rural livelihoods. You know, climate change and environmental degradations is playing a big role in exacerbating this conflict. It happens gradually, but you can definitely see over the past 20 years that this has really kind of put stress on land resources and created kind of a zero-sum mentality in terms of these farmer-herder issues. And I really do stress environmental degradation separate from climate change, because while climate change is exacerbating these issues, kind of the immediate catalyst is found often in kind of overpopulation and inefficient farming mechanisms or grazing mechanisms that mean that what land is available is not necessarily being utilized as efficiently as it could be, which again leads to this kind of zero-sum mindset. But I also think, and this kind of goes into Dr. Koenig's point a bit, it becomes very easy to talk about farmer-herder conflict across West Africa by looking at all the similarities between them. You know, climate change, there's an ethnic dimension, all that, et cetera, et cetera. And that's very important. It's important to look at these similarities, and indeed, that's one of the main purposes of this kind of panel. But I also think it's very important not to kind of leave out the politics and the political equation, because as you look around, you'll see that, you know, each country has its own unique political context that explains the way that farmer-herder tensions have developed in the way they have in one country and not in another. So, you know, Nigeria is very interesting, and the more I've been looking into this and looking at the history of land use in Nigeria, you realize that it's an incredibly complex kind of issue that really begins in the colonial era, with particularly in the north with the British system of indirect rule, which creates this kind of very confusing parallel system where the vast majority of people, you know, whether they're farmers or herders, are kind of continuing to use these traditional pre-colonial systems of land management where you can, you know, pass down land hereditarily, or you can, you know, purchase it from an emir, you know, a traditional ruler or what have you. But in fact, the vast majority of people don't realize that, you know, the land is actually owned by someone else. And in the colonial era, it was owned by the British. Ultimately, the buck stops with the Queen. And then since 1978, it's been owned by the federal government. And I'm being conscious of time here, so I'll try to speed this up. You know, the federal government, and in particularly with the advent of democracy in the Fourth Republic in 1999, you have the introduction of new political actors onto the scene, and land use issues become very contentious. And so this, you know, this criminal insurgency that's really of pretty shocking proportions, and I kind of always harp on that because I really think that the conflict isn't getting nearly as much attention kind of internationally as maybe it should, just because it's been overshadowed by other issues, or perhaps because it defies easy characterization. But so what you see is that, this very bloody conflict that has led to, thousands of people taking up arms is kind of rooted in, again, these socioeconomic conditions that are typical or characteristic of many African societies, but that kind of have particularly developed or deteriorated in a way that is unique to Nigeria's 20-year or 22-year experiment with democracy. And I'll just very quickly on this issue of ideology, and this is something perhaps we can talk more about in Q&A or what have you. But what really is interesting about banditry is that it's not fully motivated by a core coherent ideology. But this is not to say that it's an apolitical phenomenon. So the term that I've been using to describe the conflict in the Northwest, and particularly to describe the largest kind of bandit or most powerful militants in the area, is the term bandit warlord. Because I think that putting an emphasis on that second phrase is actually quite important, because there are elements of warlordism. This idea that you're a de facto sovereign of a circumscribed area in such a way that undermines the state. The idea that you mobilize around political issues and communal grievances and such. You see that with many of these bandits. But at the same time, the bandits lack a coherent ideology. So what you have is a deteriorating socioeconomic condition that's driven very much by political factors and that has a strong political dimension. And you have, what you have is communities are developing grievances that are at their core political. It's questions about what role should the state be playing in, adjudicating land disputes? How do the security forces treat farmers, as opposed to herders, right? Many of the bandits took up arms because they believe that the security forces have been abusing them and particularly profiling ethnic Fulani as herders. So these are fundamentally political questions. And the bandits to this day, they have political grievances and they mobilize around political grievances, but they're also not advancing a coherent political agenda, unlike, say, the Islamic State West Africa province or Al-Shabaab, which have been pretty clear and vocal since the beginning what it is they're trying to achieve. And it's in some ways it makes the conflict very complicated and difficult from certainly from any kinetic perspective. In some ways, it's also probably better than the alternative because you have more than 10,000 of these guys. They spend as much time fighting each other as they do government security forces. And if they were to band together, they could march on Abuja. They're just a few kilometers outside in many instances. But instead, you have this kind of this element, again, similar to warlordism, where the individual gangs have these relatively parochial interests, where no gang controls more than, say, 1,000 fighters and one part of a local government. But they are nonetheless kind of mobilizing around these political issues. So I think from the perspective, I just said very quickly, from the perspective of solutions, I don't have a silver bullet. I don't think there is a silver bullet to this. I'm still kind of in the process of my research of kind of developing more articulate solutions. But one trend that I've kind of observed and that I think, analysts and academics and practitioners should be aware of is that these bandits over the past few years have gotten so powerful in many instances that they're de facto power brokers. And again, that's where this element of warlordism comes in. They're not just criminals, they also have a political dimension to them where they're acting as de facto sovereigns in certain areas. And so what that means is that, the state governments in the Northwest, more so than the federal government, the state governments, even though they don't like to admit this, are already in a position where they have to negotiate with the bandits. And that can be over simple things like, hey, can you prevent this other gang from attacking this area for a month so the farmers can go out and farm? Or, it also manifests in these what are presented as amnesties, but what are really broader attempts at a peace deal. This idea that essentially, like, the bandits are so powerful that multiple times the state governors have had to come in and say, like, look, put down your arms and we will provide for you in one way or another, whether it's economic, trying to ensure that the security forces aren't pursuing you or whatever. And then these peace deals have all broken down, unfortunately, for one reason or another. But so I think that one kind of possible historical parallel that we may be heading to in the Northwest is something like the Niger Delta, where it's kind of, the insurgency down there is a perennial problem where you have new actors occasionally emerging, but oftentimes it's actually the same actors with somewhat, different hats or different names on them. But essentially the state's response there, after attempting kinetic solutions that ultimately failed, the state's response was essentially co-optation. And there's an interesting dimension in Niger Delta that's not quite present in the Northwest, which is you have the presence of foreign multinationals. And so a lot of these militants ended up getting jobs essentially working for the multinationals. And that's potentially something that might happen if, say, Barrick or one of these mining companies were to come into the Northwest and start exploiting the gold reserves there. But for now, that kind of foreign multinational dimension isn't there. But I bring up the Niger Delta example not as kind of a preferred solution, because essentially what it is the government deputized warlords, and as we've seen in Afghanistan, Chechnya, any of these other places, that's certainly not a model for good governance. It doesn't and it doesn't bring long-term stability. It doesn't address these root causes. What it does is it gives the political elites enough breathing space to survive without having to fundamentally alter the status quo. And I think that Dr. Conan's point is very important there. The reason that banditry has become such a headline issue within Nigeria today, even more so than Boko Haram, is because in fact, some of the elites in the Northwest are now themselves targets. Because if there's not a local airport, you have to travel by road, and that makes you very vulnerable. And so we're getting to the point where even the elites are recognizing that something needs to be done about this, even after they've ignored it for many years. But I fear that the solution is not going to be, okay, let's get together and really try to address these root causes. It's going to be something more like we saw in the Niger Delta, this issue of co-optation. So I think I've spoken enough. There's lots to be said about this. So if anyone has any questions, but just want to thank everyone for giving me the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Mr. Barnett. Indeed, the presentation was quite useful and very informative. Let me just do a quick check to check if Professor Abubakar Muazu is here with us. Otherwise, we can jump straight into the Q&A session. So, Professor Muazu, let me just have a quick look. I guess not. Well, distinguished participants, the session was quite informative. Indeed, we looked at some strong messages were coming out. The harder approach, or kinetic military defense-centric approach versus a softer approach. The necessity to reoccupy the spaces that are being liberated, at least by the defense and security forces, and then being able to address the root causes and the underlying factors and drivers of conflict is quite important in that sense. And then the military approach itself does provide us with opportunities and added value. Opportunities in a sense that it brings populations closer to their protectors in that sense, one. And second, these protectors also will have to extend I would say their actions in order to move beyond the security and protection aspect, but rather to provide basic services, so on and so forth. The necessity to also involve civil society and then the private sector in much of the operations that are there to reoccupy the space that is being liberated or at least taken over by the defense and security services. We heard about the adaptive peace building approach, which I think is something that we have to look deeply into. We also have to measure the quick, I would say, wins of security versus lasting peace, and this is quite important in that respect. We heard about this necessity also to distinguish between the types of violence and banditry, and sometimes we have a tendency of looking at transnational organized crime, but not really looking at national organized crime, which in countries that are facing terrorism could be quite, confusing. There is a need, therefore, again, not only to define terrorism and insurgency, but also to look at the problem that we have at hand, to be able to adapt the approach and provide the effective and lasting solutions to the problem. Issues of climate change, indeed, land issues, environmental degradation are some of the factors that may or are contributing to the continued instability and so on and so forth. Again, very good presentations. I'll open the floor. I don't want to be running another, making another presentation, but rather give the floor to you, the participants, to ask questions or seek clarification or help us, look at it from your point of view. So the floor is yours. Thank you. We have about 6 minutes. If I can ask you to, to express your wish to take the floor by a show of hand, use the reaction button at the bottom. Okay, we have Orioli and then Mr. Oriola, I beg your pardon, and Mr. Juan. So please, Mr. Oriola, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My question is for the second speaker, and it concerns the discursive link that's been made, at least within Nigeria, about banditry and terrorism. So I guess my question is, would you consider the current waves of banditry in Nigeria terrorism? And if yes, why or why not? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just move to the second question. That way I can give the floor back to the panelists to answer you. Okay, Mr. Bagu, please.
Okay, thank you. Okay, yes. Actually looking at, I've been looking at Boko Haram, and I've been advocating for non-military approach to countering terrorism. And I did a study in 2015, and I released a paper on that. So, but the issue is it's really difficult to get Nigerian government to look into non-military approaches. And my question is there any way an organization like yours, being a big organization that is African-centered, can get involved in trying to find a way to get the Nigerian government to look into non-military strategies? Because their approach to countering Boko Haram is purely military, and Boko Haram is not a product of military program. So using purely military approach to countering terrorism is definitely not working, as we've seen in Afghanistan. So how is this organization or this program going to make it easy to find a point of entry into making Nigerian government look beyond military force as a strategy for countering terrorism? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I guess the question is for the moderator, not the panelists. Let me just move back to the panelists and then come back to, provide you with some answers. So if I can ask Mr. Barnett, I think the question from Mr. Oriola was targeted towards you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah. And just want to start off by saying, Dr. Oriola, I really liked your piece on ordinary soldiers in Boko Haram. I recently cited it and also spent a few weeks at Command Guest House in Maiduguri, where I heard a lot of kind of similar perspectives. So I was thinking about your article that whole time. So, this question of are what the bandits doing terrorism? I mean, there are really two elements to that. The first is kind of conceptual and definitional, if you will, discursive, as you say. And the other is a more concrete question about, ties and relationships between the bandits and, the insurgents in the Northeast and the Sahel. I gave a long presentation on this earlier a few weeks ago, so I can go on at length. But I think the simple answer to that first point, the discursive point, is that legally within Nigeria, my understanding based on the 2013 Counter-Terrorism Act, all that stuff, is that much of what the bandits are doing would be considered terrorism in a legal sense in terms of within Nigeria. Often this debate over, is it terrorism, criminality, insurgency? Often the question there is, it's an important debate to have because there are real implications of do we use a law enforcement or a military response? I mean, as is pretty clear at this point, like that debate, that ship has sailed in Nigeria, right? This is a militarized issue. I was just up in Sokoto, where they are claiming to be pulverizing the bandits, with aircraft and tanks. But as I saw, that's overstating the progress, certainly. But you could say that, yes, legally, according to in the Nigerian context, many of these operations are, the violence is terroristic. The disclaimer here is that the bandits are a diverse lot. Some of the groups are much more involved in, violent raiding or mass kidnappings. Others are more kind of like I would call them almost Fulani ethnic self-defense militias, but even then they get involved in cattle rustling and such. I tend to, my kind of analytical approach is I actually tend to think that terrorism is not always the most useful frame, because I think that most of the organizations we consider terrorist organizations, especially post 9/11, and especially in the African context, they're insurgent groups that sometimes employ terrorism. So I would say that the bandits it's more academically, kind of precise to call them, criminal insurgents, bandit warlords. But I certainly don't begrudge any Nigerian, especially in the media or whatever, who looks at them and says, this violence is horrible, they're destroying communities, this is terrorism. I understand that the normative aspect, if you will. The second question is very complex, and I'm planning to have a publication out on this soon, and I've actually alluded to it in some other pieces. But the simple answer is, I'm actually, from what I've seen, I think that Boko Haram specifically, both the JS faction and ISWAP, have not had as much success integrating with the bandits as I think a lot of commentators assume. Or rather, in some instances, they've had so much success that the commanders that ISWAP and Boko Haram have sent to the Northwest to recruit bandits have just themselves become bandits instead. They said, they've got that militant skill set. They say, okay, yeah, we're going to keep fighting, but we're not going to do it in the name of jihad. We just, we want the money, the guns, the cattle. So that's, it's an issue that you could talk about at length, but I think that actually it's helpful to have a bit of skepticism, especially with some of the news reports circulating now showing, the Boko Haram's relocating, they're doing all this stuff. I think it's good to have a skeptical eye to reports of jihadism in the Northwest, although there definitely are some jihadist cells, which, requires another lecture or article, if you will.
Thank you, Dr. Barnett. As to the question that was targeting, or at least that was requested by us as an institution, AU institution, I know that my colleague Emmanuel will be stepping in session 4, but all I can say is that for a few years now, we've been, promoting the idea of a softer approach, a whole of government, whole of society approach to the prevention and combating of terrorism and violent extremism on the continent. We've been providing support to many of the countries to develop their PVE plan of action, in addition to encouraging them to involve non-state, I would say, non-governmental and non-military actors in the development of these plans and implementation. I'm sure Emmanuel will speak about that. In terms of Nigeria, I think many efforts, and we have to say that a lot of efforts have been conducted by the Nigerian government. It goes without saying that they have in place a prevention of violent extremism strategy, which at least on paper, grants a very important aspect to the involvement of civil society, but also to the involvement of private sector. And they're doing a lot of work in terms of winning the hearts of minds and building the trust between the populations and local governments. These things take time. That's the problem. When we're looking at, structural challenges and structural, I would say, issues, when we look at developmental, I would say, objectives, these things take time. They are not easily, I would say, appreciated. But I know for a fact that a lot is being done, at least from a Nigerian perspective, because we work closely with the Office of National Security Advisor on the teams that are working and driving and implementing these strategies. However, the security approach, is predominant because this will be your quick win, and it's much more easily, I would say, demonstrated on the ground. That's why sometimes it's a bit challenging to see, and it's sometimes too early also to judge and think that, once government, or at least the governments in place, are not really giving, efforts or making efforts in order to address the root causes of these things. Nigeria, I would say Mali and other countries within the region are facing the same difficulties, is striking this balance between the military-centric approach, but also ensuring that citizens are not joining terrorists or not using violence in order to express their grievances, and also in order to express their frustrations in that respect. So from that point of view, Doctor, the AU is doing a lot in terms of promotion, in terms of education, in terms of training. But again, it resides also with the level, it resides with the member states to implement these recommendations, but also to invest, because these require huge investments that will take a long time to appreciate in terms of outputs and results. So with that, dear colleagues, I think we went about 4 minutes over time. I do beg the patience of Professor Sami. I hope I did not, exploit and eat up a lot of today's session, but I was trying to make up for the 5-minute break that we had. And I hand the floor back to you. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you, Mr. Lallali. You did a fantastic job. We took away some of your time, and you've actually done great in terms of moderating and making sure we stay on track. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Oriola, who's going to moderate session 2. He's got several speakers that will come in, so I think he's going to have another challenging task, which is to keep us on track, but I know he will do a great job. It's nice to see you again, Professor Oriola. We met, I think, a few years back. I believe you visited Carleton University once for a talk. So it's great to see you again today at this meeting. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sami. I'm delighted to join you guys. Welcome to session number 2, Counter-insurgency and Terrorism in Africa, Current Status and Trends. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from the University of Alberta here in Edmonton, and the U of A is on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route to a number of First Nations peoples, including the Cree, the Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, and so forth. Their footsteps have marked these lands for centuries, and I identify with their enormous sacrifices and ongoing quest for a fairer and more equitable society. Welcome. I've been asked to speak for about 15 minutes. I will be timing myself, and I understand that each of the presenters after me have 10 minutes each. I'll try to be as strict as possible, beginning with myself. I'm going to share my screen in a moment. Right, so my topic today is troop welfare and counterterrorism, the salience of military organization. I'll be making 2 related arguments. First, that meso-sociological variables in military organizations may render ineffective counterterrorism operations and strategies. And second, I will argue that troop welfare needs to be a centerpiece of counterterrorism strategies whenever a kinetic approach is adopted. And of course, I recognize the problematic that kinetic approaches pose. However, those approaches are prevalent as we speak. A number of these stats are not new to most, if not all of you. The inundation of private citizens and property by Boko Haram and ISWAP in Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin. Of course, the use of hostage-taking bombings, particularly suicide bombings, and so forth. Now, this has led to an explosive growth in the scholarly literature on Boko Haram, from analysis of the root causes to a constellation of transgenerational Islamic militant organizations, the links amongst them, their religious ideologies, framing the use of women, particularly with respect to suicide bombings, their consequent human displacement, and so forth. Now, but there's scant literature on the engagement of state forces in the war against Boko Haram. I find this quite interesting, given the operations that have been going on there for well over a decade now. Much of the evidence that's available comes from 3 main sources: reports by human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch, videos and confessional statements posted on social media by soldiers who were dissatisfied with the goings on, and of course, media reports on poor equipment, unpaid allowances, and so forth. Now, with very few exceptions, such as those noted on the screen, these have been the sources of our understanding of engagement of state forces in the war against Boko Haram. Now, there's, of course, literature on the Nigerian military in general and the army in particular. I'm not going to overflog any of this in order to save time, but essentially 6 main thematics available. Now, to the current study, I should note that this is published in the journal African Affairs. It was released in April of this year. I'm happy to provide the full bibliographic detail at the end of my talk. So 2 main questions. What are the experiences of soldiers who have fought against Boko Haram? And what can their experiences teach us about the seeming incapacity of the Nigerian military to defeat Boko Haram? This is essentially a qualitative study, and it involved interviews with 24 non-commissioned soldiers in the Nigerian army. This is of course, a small sample given the thousands, literally, of soldiers who have been deployed at one time or the other in the war against Boko Haram. Inclusion criteria included being Nigerian soldiers. So this was primarily meant for Nigerian soldiers who had had at least one deployment in the theater in the northeast of Nigeria. These interviews with the rank and file soldiers were conducted in 2018. And I also supplement findings and cross-articulate the revelations from the soldiers with previous interviews with senior military officers, a couple of whom are quoted later on. I'll share a few themes depending on how much time I have and keeping track here. Theme number 1 is antipathy towards what the soldiers consider a rubbish mission. Simply put, the soldiers do not believe in the mission. Now, this has 3 interrelated elements. First, they have suspicions about the sponsors and godfathers of Boko Haram. Second, the soldiers are upset over the patronage system they believe is involved in deployment into key positions on the war front. And third, the soldiers believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged because it has essentially become a money-making machinery for the political and military elite. This believes these perspectives are shared by all of those I interviewed. Now, in a quote here from one of the male soldiers interviewed may shed light on that. And he says, I'm quoting now, the integrity of the system is no longer there. If you don't belong to their own group, their own caucus, you can never be a GOC of anywhere. And the soldier goes on to say that because the whole thing is because the more we die, the more money they make. And that's a direct quote from this soldier. Now, second theme, poor morale. Now, this has 2 key elements, the welfare of soldiers on the war front. This includes a broad spectrum of initial information or signal about being deployed to the northeast, transportation, food provision, supplies, uniforms, boots, and so on and so forth. And second, the treatment of families of comrades who died in battle. These variables have led to poor morale amongst the troops. And one of the 3 female soldiers in the sample speaks of feeling bad for the dead, how their families are treated, how they're kicked out of the barracks within a few months of dying, and their salaries being stopped, and so on and so forth, and the neglect of their families. And therefore, and she speaks of how the experiences of her colleagues who have died, paid the supreme sacrifice for Nigeria, was in fact impacting the morale of those on the front lines. The third theme, bifurcated provision of military hardware and ammunition. Now, for many years, we've largely taken for granted the perspective that the troops lacked weapons, and that when weapons were available, more often than not, they were obsolete. Some of those reportedly going back to the Shagari regime back in the late 1970s and late 1980s. This study finds that it's a question of who you ask and when they served, and that the soldiers essentially were demonstrating ethical solipsism, the idea of taking one's experience as the only reality out there. So variation in supplies, this study finds depends on 1, the specific unit, 2, the specific period of deployment, and 3, the agency of commanders. Essentially, the willingness of commanders to disobey orders if their needs or requirements for an operation were not met. Now, and in one of the interviews that I had with a soldier, he was in fact surprised that any soldier would claim that they didn't have any weapons. And his perspective was that when the moment the government declared this a war, that a lot of arms and ammunition flowed in. Now, this, of course, was not the experience of all others from different units and battalions. So again, accentuating the fact that it's a function of who you ask, when they served, and under what commander they served. Theme number 4, intelligence leaks and sabotage. Now, this has been very much in the news, and confirmation of which came during the Jonathan administration, when, as many of you may recall, President Jonathan declared that there were Boko Haram sympathizers in his government and cabinet. Now, more often than not, senior commissioned officers were often blamed for intelligence leaks. Now, one of the senior military officers interviewed, specifically one from the defense headquarters that I interviewed in 2015, and who held a very prominent position in the military setup during the Jonathan administration, was very clear that, I'm quoting now, if we were to reverse the situation, the degree of sabotage, the degree of distrust we were getting, we could not depend on the army of that period. And he uses this as an entry point to why mercenaries were contracted, and how high-level meetings, it seemed that discussions at high-level meetings went into the open, and that troops suffered a lot of casualties because there were too many leaks coming out from that high-level body. Now, and of course, despite the extensive focus on senior military officers, I was also able to gather that, in fact, there were instances where rank and file troops were crossing over to the other side, rendering services for Boko Haram, including one tank driver whose case was cited by another general that I interviewed back in 2015. Theme number 5, and this is the last theme, and then I'll wrap things up. Suicide and murder suicide among troops. There has, in fact, been a pattern of suicides and murder suicides among the troops, as reported by the media. Generally, the defense headquarters and army headquarters have been silent about the exact numbers, and all they've done occasionally would be to either confirm or refute news of suicide or murder suicide by troops. But the study finds that there are, in fact, 6 critical factors responsible for suicides and murder suicide among troops. The length of deployment, this often ranges from 6 months to as many as 4 or more years. Traumatic experiences that they had in battle, their poor physical and mental welfare, the concerns about the welfare of their family members back home, the poor rehabilitation services following deployment, and personal tragedies. In other words, life happening essentially to some of them. And when you had the fact that they were at the war front, that made some essentially commit suicide or attempt suicide. Now, one of the soldiers who was interviewed argues about an individual being at the war front for 4 years, and that such a person could go mad. And quite literally, some did go mad. Again, there are no hard numbers on those, but there are regular media reports around what's been going on. Now, one of the female soldiers interviewed lays it out very clearly. She had been part of a unit that was on a mission to recover bodies of soldiers who had been killed by Boko Haram folks. And she speaks of acid being poured on them by Boko Haram, and how they had to literally pack the bodies because the disintegration had set in, decomposition, and they had to literally pack the bodies of their comrades. And that some didn't, in fact, get shot by Boko Haram. They had died of hunger and tiredness. And just as an example of a soldier that they found under a tree with their hands folded on the rifle. And that this sort of encounters, these kinds of incidents affected the mental health of the troops. And when you had the fact that the rehabilitation after deployment was incredibly poor, that exacerbated the situation. I do not have the time to go to details regarding that. Now, so what are the implications of these findings? Well, the voices of non-commissioned soldiers sent on counter-terrorism and other missions are often marginalized. The military generally fosters an atmosphere of silence, even in extreme cases of abuse, because of the strictures, discipline, and the internalized sense that speaking out erodes camaraderie. Rank-and-file troops in particular self-censor because of their relatively powerless position and fear of retaliation. Therefore, instances where they speak out without official approval or surveillance are instructive. Participants in this study demonstrate antipathy towards the mission, as has been pointed out, and antipathy towards the mission is not unusual among troops. Much of this, however, often centers on soldiers' attitudes towards the location, e.g. a foreign country, and their population. Troops often hold perspectives about the significance of their country's involvement in the mission, the importance of their presence in the location, and the value of the operation. Now, where national unity or survival is concerned, studies show, soldiers may have favorable disposition towards such a mission. Consequently, in an intrastate counterterrorism effort against an entity engaged in kidnapping, rape, and killings of civilians and security forces, the antipathy of participants towards the mission is intriguing. Now, rather than shaped by the enemy, location, or the value of the cause, it is influenced by organizational factors within the military and soldiers' apprehension of the dynamics of the political process. The study provides evidence of widespread perceptions of soldiers that political and military elites have contributed to prolonging this battle against Boko Haram through interference in routine military activities, politicization of defense resources, poor welfare, and demoralization of troops. Now, organizational problems within the military have led to radically conflicting perspectives regarding the quality and availability of hardware and weapons. Human agency is a crucial element in any organization. However, providing resources based on the agency of commanders, that is, their reputation and intransigence against superiors, is counterproductive. It is capable of creating divisions among military leaders who ought to work collaboratively. It also feeds into concerns about the patronage and cronyism in the political military system. Intelligence leaks and sabotage by security agencies often speak to broader macro-sociological issues beyond greed. The emergence of a third force in South Africa at the twilight of apartheid readily comes to mind. The saboteurs, this time in South Africa, disagreed with the direction that South Africa was headed, the creation of a rainbow nation state. The South African example is didactic as it points to the link between the political process and sabotage or intelligence leaks by security officials. Consequently, attempts to prevent intelligence leaks and sabotage must go beyond a legalistic approach, such as punishing offenders. Leaks and sabotage under the Jonathan administration were largely connected to the ethno-religiously charged presidential politics in 2015. The military was interpolated in the politics of regime change. Now, I don't have the time to go into details on that, but I'm happy to speak to that during the Q&A. Now, I'm skipping a few things now just to save time. Now, participants narrated their experiences as soldiers rather than members of any particular ethnic or religious group. This is a surprising narrative coherence. Nevertheless, the persistence of Boko Haram threatens the efforts against it threaten the fabric of the Nigerian army. And troops' experiences in this theater have left them demoralized and desertions have increased. Finally, evidence from government and media reports support perceptions of rank-and-file troops that the counterterrorism efforts against Boko Haram has led to criminal enrichment of a handful of senior officers. This is contrary to the bureaucratic organizational model, the prevailing perspective on protracted small wars or intra-state wars and so forth. This model presupposes that the small wars are prolonged because of the military's desire to maximize its influence, resources, and relative autonomy from civilian leadership. But this approach fails to put into consideration, and this is why this is important, the interplay of the political context, the character of the state, and the identities and the actions of the military echelon in a weak institutional environment. Thank you. I will stop sharing now and begin to call on my co-presenters one after the other. First up is Dr. Akin Olojo from the Institute for Security Studies in Dakar, Senegal. Dr. Olojo, please, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Professor Oriola, for the compelling presentation. And it's nice to be reconnected. Something that struck me as you spoke, it's the ever-present problem or question of political will. And I'm hoping that in the various sessions at this event, we'll have the chance to speak about this. I've been given 10 minutes, so I'll go straight to my presentation. Previous speakers referred to the Lake Chad Basin, and I'll be taking us a bit deeper into that context. I'd like to share my screen. Just kindly confirm if you are able to see it. Just a few seconds, please. Okay. I'm not sure if it's showing. Thank you.
You can see the screen.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're looking at the emerging trends of violent extremism in the Lake Chad Basin. And the story of Boko Haram in the Lake Chad Basin has been told so many times. So I'll skip all the details we're already familiar with and just go straight into what is most important in the recent months and what this means for not only addressing the crisis of stabilization, but also for local communities. So I'll be taking us in three specific directions. First, a number of trends have unfolded without a doubt since the death of Abubakar Shekau, and I'll say a few words regarding this. We'll discuss the security implications of these trends for the Lake Chad Basin, and finally, some words on implications and recommendations for stabilization, as I noted earlier. In the first case, in terms of the actions of Boko Haram, or the so-called Islamic State West Africa Province, ISWAP, since Shekau's death in May this year, we've observed the ascendancy of ISWAP and its attempts to consolidate territory. Now, we may recall that ISWAP was the rival Boko Haram faction pitched against Shekau's faction, which we refer to by the acronym JAS. The second thing is that ISWAP has tried to move in and fill the vacuum created by the departure of Shekau, thereby presenting itself as some kind of dominant, violent extremist group in the region. And under the guidance of course, the so-called Islamic State, ISIS, it has tried to reorganize itself, including efforts to establish 4 semi-autonomous provinces and the expansion of its territories. And with the new territories and fighters in its ranks, it sort of appears that we could say that ISWAP is arguably bigger than it was 6 months ago. And this is why it is very important that the group is denied the space to settle in and operate in the Lake Chad Basin. The third thing that is clear so far since Shekau's death has been the reduction in the frequency of attacks. Interestingly, we're referring to attacks particularly against civilians, with most attacks now targeting security forces. In Nigeria's Borno State, for example, which is the epicenter of the crisis in the region, 3 months before Shekau's death, his faction, that's JAS, was responsible for around 43% of attacks by our observations at the Institute for Security Studies. And this resulted in around 38 civilian deaths, at least. But 3 months after his death, his faction was responsible for an approximate 4% of attacks in the state, that's Borno State, with little record of civilian casualties. The fourth trend in the region relates to the desertion of Jazz fighters, that's the faction of Shekau. ISWAP appears to be finding it difficult to convince Jazz fighters to join its faction. And since it took over Jazz's former territories, especially areas in and around Sambisa Forest, there have been waves of mass disengagement of both civilians and fighters. The fighters who were loyal to the late Shekau are opting to surrender to security forces from what we're seeing rather than joining ISWAP. And this has unexpectedly rattled ISWAP to some extent into launching even reprisal attacks against fleeing fighters. There are a few slides I have here. We might not have time to really sort of examine them, but they just give us a sense of what at the ISS we're speaking about when we make comparisons between what was happening before Shekau's death and the immediate period after he died. Now, here as well is another slide very quickly, referring to what I just mentioned. And now, when we speak about the implications of these trends, we should bear in mind that these are still early days. And of course, the dynamics are always shifting rapidly. There's a lot of flux in the Lake Chad Basin as other contexts. Nevertheless, we should take into account a number of points and also what they mean for security in the region. So first is the likely expansion of territories by ISWAP, as I noted, which is already ongoing. With the breakdown of ISWAP into 4 provinces, the group will likely need more space. The second is less attacks on civilians, which I also mentioned earlier. And there are likely to be more attempts to target security forces, but of course, we can also expect the tendency for increased military responses to address this. The Multinational Joint Task Force, that's the MNJTF, and of course, the Nigerian military in particular have conducted several raids against Boko Haram, including airstrikes. And these have resulted in the deaths of some Boko Haram members or even commanders. The third implication is the potential increase in intra and inter-group rivalries, that's including infightings, attacks, and reprisals within ISWAP, and also between ISWAP and Jazz, which is Shekau's faction. At the moment, the ongoing reorganization of ISWAP does not necessarily mean a stronger or more effective ISWAP. Yes, we've been talking about how it's trying to expand, but then it doesn't mean that the group is particularly stronger or the faction is stronger. At this stage, it perhaps suggests that the group's evolution and desire to build on its resilience and longevity is at play. I would like to gradually just take us to some broader or additional implications, 4 of which I have listed here, and of course, accompanied by recommendations for stabilization in the region. I'm trying to be mindful of my time. I guess it's already going quickly. The first relates to governance and development concerns. Now, ISWAP has an exploitative approach that aims to win hearts and minds, and it has demonstrated this character from time to time. For instance, at the end of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan earlier this year, photos emerged of ISWAP fighters giving money to civilians while also preaching to them. And this seemingly people-friendly approach needs to be matched and even superseded by the leadership of countries, the governments in the Lake Chad Basin. It is therefore vital that governance, development, and humanitarian efforts be intensified in terms of what is offered to civilians compared to what ISWAP can offer them. Roads should be constructed, markets should be rebuilt, micro loans should be given to community members who are in need of this. And there's a need to revive the economic life of the region. And one of the previous speakers, I believe it was Dr. Cedric, he mentioned something about how we shouldn't just have that linear approach, but have sort of a concomitant approach whereby development needs are addressed alongside security needs. Now, The second point, and in terms of demobilization and reintegration concerns, this is a very key one. States should use the opportunity of the ongoing desertions by fighters to further weaken the group. However, these disengagements should be properly managed in order to reap the benefits and prevent problems such as recidivism. So it's therefore important to strengthen the capacities of existing reception structures and mechanisms. We've already seen some gaps in terms of DDR in the region. And again, in the case of Nigeria, there are gaps. I mean, these are things which relate to, for instance, addressing the specific needs of women and children or juveniles. Communities should also be consulted when issues of reintegration are raised. They shouldn't be placed at the very end of this process. They need to be carried along. The third point, which is important here, is in regard to the potential for intra and intergroup rivalries in ISWAP. I noted this earlier, and it's important that governments in the region and the military in particular inspire strategies that can take advantage of these tussles within the group. Now, over the last 5 years, ISWAP or even Boko Haram, I mean, we can say, has experienced at least 5 leadership challenges or changes rather. Governments and indeed the military can inspire strategies that can take advantage of this and see how they can degrade. But then, of course, we must be reminded that we're not just looking at a security-based approach, but one which should be accompanied by other forms of responses. The final point relates to an earlier concern regarding how ISIS is attempting to strengthen its grip on the Lake Chad Basin through ISWAP. Therefore, countries of the Lake Chad Basin, as partners of the global coalition to defeat Daesh or ISIS, should remain actively engaged in the network of efforts aimed at shrinking the influence of ISIS globally, and particularly in Africa. In fact, affected countries should be seen as playing an active role in leading transnational efforts against ISIS and its affiliates. For example, the recent June ministerial meeting of the Global Coalition, which was held in, I believe, in Madrid. These are spaces where the LCB countries can share lessons and also learn experiences and also share theirs, in addition to even mobilizing resources, as well as making use of what we have on the continent. All these are vital and should be taken more seriously. I think I'm out of time. I would like to conclude. I see the chair is already smiling, so I know my time is up here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Olojo, for your fine presentation. During the Q&A, I'm going to take you on the DDR and specifically the seeming lack of buy-in by the public vis-a-vis the release of so-called repentant or supposedly rehabilitated Boko Haram fighters, and including ISWAP fighters in the region. But we'll address that in a moment. We're moving on now to the next speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Idriss Mounir Lallali from CAERT in Algiers. Over to you, Mr. Lallali.
Thanks. Bye. Okay. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for giving me the floor again. I think it's going to be an engaging day today, indeed. As let me jump straight into the presentation. We heard repeatedly this morning that the threat on our continent is real, resilient, persistent, and is expanding, and very likely to continue to do so in the near future. Groups such as Boko Haram, the Movement for the Support of Islam and Muslims, the Islamic State in Greater Sahara, the Islamic State West Africa Province, and Al-Shabaab have undeniably stepped up attacks in their zones of operations. While terrorists affiliated to the so-called the Islamic State Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah have also claimed new territory in Mozambique. ADF and the Islamic State Central Africa Province also continue deadly attacks against civilians and defense and security forces in the DRC. The terror groups on the continent are continuously morphing and mutating, going through a continuous cycle of mergers and acquisitions, hostile takeovers, reorganizations and redeployment. At the same time, they're forging strategic alliances, playing a leading role in certain parts of the continent when it's suitable, while comfortable to play a secondary role in others. Clearly, terrorism on the African continent has in fact been on the increase. 2021 is not looking promising, as many countries have suffered the most violent attacks in their history, such as the Solhan attack in the region of the Sahel of Burkina Faso, which resulted in over 160 civilians deaths. This attack was a demonstration of the high level of sophistication and execution that terrorists have reached, with terrorist attacking soldiers, cutting off roads with IEDs, and then destroying, the village of Solhan, as we know, after targeting informal gold mine workers. This attack also reflects the growing exploitation of gold mines by terrorists in the Sahel, including by GNIM and ISGS as a source of revenue for their movements. Terrorists, as we heard this morning from the commissioner himself, are increasingly relying on various forms of crime in order to finance their operations. And here we're, as I made comments earlier, transnational organized crime, but also national organized crime in that respect. Kidnap for ransom is in the increase, along with illegal exploitation of natural resources, including livestock trafficking, drug trafficking, and so on and so forth. They exploit local grievances for recruitment purposes and to gain the support of local communities. They're also aiming to translate the local grievances into actions in a way to give, the impression to the populations in which they are operating as they are the protectors, or at least the guarantors of taking care of those grievances, but also, I would say, expressing those grievances, through their actions. They are expanding by that their zones of operations and zones of influence. And as we've seen, and it's demonstrated basically on a daily basis, if we look at the map of terrorism on the continent a few years back, it was just, northern Mali, southern Algeria, bits and pieces here and there. But now it's just expanded geographically at an alarming rate, expanding from northern Mali to central Mali, hitting Burkina Faso, Niger, and expanding towards the coastal countries such as Benin, Togo, and Ghana. They have increasingly employed sophisticated tactics in recent months and mounted complex attacks, whether in the Sahel, West Africa, Somalia, Mozambique, whereby they continue to attack military bases and outposts and dominated villages. They also master the use of technology, and this is something that we have to bear in mind, such as the use of drones to film their operations and attacks. And we had so many of these instances this year. It's a question of time before, they will use armed drones to commit attacks. They're also mastering the use of, sophisticated weapons such as surface-to-air missiles, and I think we have across the continent a few of those examples. They are destroying infrastructure, assassinating community leaders, and raiding security installations in very coordinated and highly sophisticated strikes and manner. They have consolidated their positions, again, with alienated and marginalized communities, and this is where the aspect of softer approach, addressing the root causes, addressing the grievances of local populations becomes crucial to our work. They're also exploiting crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic to win the hearts and minds of populations by providing basic services to communities, filling even the humanitarian vacuum left by the humanitarian actors on the ground. So we see they will exploit any opportunity that is offered to them to win the hearts and minds of populations and to act in that respect as a de facto authority, building by that popular support for their cause and proto-states. Basically, if we had to paint, a clear picture of what's happening on the continent, the security situation from the point of view of terrorism continues to deteriorate despite all our efforts, including those of our international partners that are present on the ground. The present situation, therefore, calls for an urgent recalibration of our approach to adequately address the threats in all its forms and manifestations, and in particular, its root causes. The approach needs to be flexible and reactive enough to allow us to adjust to the development of the threat. And this is quite important. It seems that we're always reacting and not being able to adjust our approach, the solutions to the threat that we have, the mutation, the forms that it takes. We also need to anticipate on how this threat is likely to evolve in nature and magnitude, but also in scope. Again, because we have been just reacting, not being able to anticipate on how this threat will evolve and adopt again, the approach to the possibilities of mutation of the threat. Our collective attention should be adopted to address a number of terrorism-related problems or counter-terrorism-related problems that might have the potential to fuel the threat that we have at hand. I think the best example is the use of foreign fighters or mercenaries in counter-terrorism operations and counter-insurgencies. What impact will this have on communities? What impact will this have on the present security situation? Will it aggravate, and how will it aggravate and impact the prevailing situation? For instance, we heard this morning, and I think from our colleague, Mr. Barnett, global warming, access to land, even access to humanitarian, support, and how this is being exploited by terrorists for their benefit. We ought to be in that position to evaluate any actions we take, any decisions we make, and evaluate and assess their impact on the prevailing security situation. We should also review, for instance, the financial implications of actual deployments in areas such as the Sahel and elsewhere, as we evaluate the existing strategies and plans of actions. We also need to anticipate how the so-called Taliban success, and this is just recent, will boost the morale of wannabe jihadists and nostalgic veteran, those veterans from the old, Afghan war. Overcoming terrorism and violent extremism will only be achieved if we collectively work together in the fight against terrorism in all its forms and manifestation. We have to be very frank with each other and be able to work hand in hand. I think we have one threat that could undermine even the existence of countries, as we've seen in Mali, for instance, where they, and in Libya, where they have and continue to go through this spiral of instability. Continued cooperation and more comprehensive approach that address the underlying drivers of terrorism and violent extremism are necessary to prevent the spread of the threat. Collective partnership actions at multilateral, continental, and regional levels against high mobile non-state armed groups and terrorists is indeed of strategic importance for lasting peace, while upholding, obviously, the principles of human rights and the rule of law. So whatever method, whatever approach we need to put in place, I think we need to have, in the horizon, the objective of having sustainable peace and being able to provide and being able to gain the populations. Without the population's support, without the population's implications, there is, I wouldn't say, I'm saying it with a great degree of confidence. We cannot win this war against these fanatics. I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to an engaging discussion. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lallali, for being incredibly conscientious about time. That's deeply appreciated. And thanks for drawing our attention to the increasing transnationalization and the use of technology by these various groups. I'm sure that members of the audience will have questions for you during the Q&A. I'm pleased to now call on Dr. Theroux Benoni. Dr. Theroux Benoni, you have the floor and you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much for the floor. It's a pleasure to join this event this afternoon in Dakar. I'm Lauriane Theroux Benoni. I'm the ISS Regional Director for the office that covers West Africa, the Sahel, and the Lake Chad Basin. It's a pleasure to see other ISS colleagues, but also brothers and sisters from other organizations. I was asked to present on the current status and trends on issues linked to counterinsurgency and terrorism in the Sahel, and I will probably expand a little bit to West Africa because I think one of the major policy mistakes we might have done in the past is to try and abstract the Sahel from West Africa, and I'll get back to that. I thought the best way to do it would be to start with some maps and allow me to share my screen with you. Could you kindly confirm that you can see my screen?
You're good to go.
Thank you so much. So I suggest the following plan for the presentation. I will start with an overview of the current status. If this can work. Yes, it does, I believe. And then beyond the series of attacks that I will present between 2012 and now, I think it's important to try and identify key trends and also policy implications. So regarding these maps, and they speak for themselves, so I won't dwell on them, but this is the status of attacks, and I will focus in particular on Mali, Burkina, and Niger. So that's the status of attacks in 2012. You'll see that most of them were actually contained in northern Mali with some exceptions. This is the level of attacks in 2013 with some expansion, but mainly the same situation as 2012. And in 2014, there's a bit of a lull, which is the result of the French-African intervention of January 2013, which led to a reorganization of the groups. But then we see that in 2015, attacks resume and they spread across the country in Mali, and also we start to see strikes in Western Niger. And obviously, I'm not mentioning the Lake Chad Basin because my colleagues before me did a great job at discussing the issue there. In 2016, we see that Côte d'Ivoire is hit. You will all remember the March attack in Grand Bassam, but this is also when Burkina Faso starts being hit in the north, but also in the capital city, Ouagadougou. This is the situation in 2017 with an intensification of attacks in central Mali and northern Burkina. In 2018, we see a very important additional front. First at the border between Niger and Burkina Faso, and then in the southern border of Burkina Faso, which links the northern states of Benin, Togo, and Ghana that Idriss was mentioning. In 2019, we see an intensification of that trend with additional attacks at the border between Burkina and Côte d'Ivoire. And in 2020, we see a similar trend. We are still compiling data for 2021, but I can tell you that the trend, unfortunately, has not improved. We're still facing a multiplication of attack and an expansion that starts threatening states beyond the Sahel. What we don't see on the map when we look at dots like this is also how groups have at the beginning multiplied, but also recoalesced under different coalitions. We also don't notice that the targets over the past 10 years have gone from symbolic high-level targets in capitals to mainly civilian targets in sometimes isolated and remote areas. This has, of course, also generated important humanitarian consequences. The trends that I would like to discuss is the result of work done by the ISS between 2016 and now, mainly in Mali, Niger, and Burkina. We conducted over 1,200 interviews with people involved in violent extremist organization, criminal activities, illicit trade, artisanal gold, illegal gold mining, and poaching, for example, or cattle wrestling. And we also interviewed people involved in local conflicts to try and understand how these various dimensions were or were not linked. Some of these interviews were conducted in prison settings and others were conducted outside of prison settings. And I have 6 main points that I would like to make in terms of both trends and policy implications. The first point that I would like to highlight is in relation to the drivers, which were also discussed before. And the great thing about taking the floor after several brilliant speakers is that it will allow me to go a bit faster on some of these points. One key dimension that comes out of our work is that protection is a key driver. Protection of oneself, protection of one's community, or protection of one's income generating activity. And so while the leadership of these groups often use discourses or narratives that are imbued and infused with religious narratives, it's interesting to see that when you speak to foot soldiers, to people involved at the lower level, lower strata of the group, the reason for joining is often not linked to religious indoctrination, but rather to trying to fix another issue that the state was not able to provide for. I think it's also important from the data we've been able to gather to rethink the economic drivers. There's an important and permanent narrative of how unemployment is a key driver. And while it might be the case in some circumstances. We've also documented lots of cases where people do have an income generating activity, but being able to joining violent extremist groups provides additional alternatives to protect this income generating activities. And as I mentioned before, this could be illicit activities such as cattle herding, or illicit activities like poaching or illegal gold mining, artisanal gold mining. The second key trend that I would like to highlight is the increasing imbrication of violent extremism, local conflicts, and illicit economies. And we were able to document in the report that I've also illustrated there, how the implication of violent extremist groups in local conflict and illicit economies is actually a way for them to be able to recruit, to get the operational means that they need in terms of arms, in terms of motorbikes, in terms of parts of motorbikes, but also to get funding by controlling artisanal gold mining sites, by selling stolen cattle from the tri-border area, all the way to sometimes coastal slaughterhouses of coastal states such as Côte d'Ivoire. This means that increasingly, and this is a key trend, violent extremist organizations have been able to increasingly get their funds, their supplies, and their human resources locally. And this is an important dimension to also keep in mind when we think of responses. I mentioned earlier how we have tended to treat the Sahel as disconnected from West Africa. The work that I have just mentioned shows how motorbikes come from Nigeria and then are smuggled through northern Benin and northern Togo before they enter Burkina and Niger. So while we have tended to extract the Sahel from West Africa, violent extremist organizations have continued to use existing network and illicit trade routes in order to be able to get the operational means and finances that they were planning on using. The third dimension that I would like to highlight, and this is a point that was also mentioned by my predecessor, is how groups have continued, and this is a continuing trend, to exploit existing vulnerabilities, no matter what they are. This means that we need to have a much deeper understanding of local context if we are to develop strategies that do not miss the target. And we need to resist the temptation to copy and paste both analysis, but also recipes when we try and develop them. I think we should also make sure we don't fall into the identifying vulnerabilities only trap. And by that, I mean that it's key to know what the vulnerabilities are, but they make sense only if they are mirrored by an analysis of state capacity to also take care of these responsibilities. And this is often what's missing in a lot of the analysis. I would like to move to the fourth trend or policy implication, and this is from work done by a colleague of mine interviewing women who played role in violent extremist organization and focusing on the Central Sahel again. It's important to highlight that although women are not always physically present, as they are sometimes in Boko Haram, for example, they do play a key role in terms of supply chain and in terms of support role. They should not be seen only as victims, although obviously a lot of them also fall victims of these groups, but as key agents sometimes in the functioning of groups. And it's interesting to see how these groups actually include or exclude women based on specific needs and strategies. The fifth policy implication or trend that I would like to highlight is in relation to military and security intervention. And I think Cedric spoke very clearly about this earlier. Obviously, military and security interventions can be key to change power dynamics. But then what's missing is what should be done then if there's a success in changing the military, the power dynamic, and if the ruling elite is still interested in doing something when that power dynamic has changed. So clearly, while these are sometimes necessary, they're always clearly insufficient, these interventions. And I think the debate that we currently hear on the media, but also in political circles about Mali, perhaps having called on to Wagner to play a role, Russian private security group, I think speaks beyond the political debate. I think it speaks about perhaps doing a deeper analysis of what 10 years of interventions in the Sahel have brought, and more largely speaking, 60 years of military and security collaboration and what lessons should be learned. Obviously, the issue of coordination, which was already raised by my colleagues and predecessors, is key, as well as the sequencing. But a lot of the questions are about the how. How should these various tools, dialogue, development, socio-economic interventions be used in sequence with additional military and security interventions? Allow me to now move to the sixth and last point.
I have to stop you here.
I'm actually finishing. It's my last slide, Ariola.
Okay.
And I'm still within my time. I have until 2030. I have 1 minute left and I'll be quick. It's the next step.
Well, actually, my alarm would say otherwise, but please go ahead and wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you for your kindness. And I'm going to be brief. I think the last point in terms of trends is the next steps. And from that, we have lots to learn about the Lake Chad Basin in terms of incentive for defections, in terms of DDR and reintegration. At one point, these issues will need to be addressed in the Sahel, and it's important to draw lessons. The impact of Sahrawis, that is also a key point to be looking into, and we probably need to speak a lot more about a preventive agenda across the board. And I'll stop here, and I'll thank you, Ariola, for your kindness and the extra 30 seconds.
Thank you very much, Dr. Laurie Theroux Benoni, for your presentation. Thanks for the rigor that you and the entire ISS team bring to the table and context. It's much appreciated. We're moving on now to the next speaker. I'm delighted to invite Dr. Mohammed Hussein Gahas. I hope I said that right, from ISS Addis Ababa. You have the floor, Mohammed Gahas. Please unmute yourself. I see the name on my screen. Okay, Dr. Mohammed Gahas, please go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. I need to share the screen with you. If you it's a bit okay. I'm trying to share my screen. It's working a bit.
Yeah, so click share screen. You see the upward green arrow, and then select your presentation and share.
Closed caption. I think I have to email to Teddy because of in here in front of me I don't have that option.
Okay, so would you mind if we went to someone else, the next person on the list, and then we would return to you? Is that okay by you?
That's fine. Let me log again. Let me rejoin.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for being understanding. Thank you. We'll move on to Dr. David Matsinhe. Dr. Matsinhe. Dr. David Matsinhe. I do not have the name displayed on my screen, but I know that sometimes people join with the account of a spouse, a colleague, and so forth, but I do not see that name. The next person on my list here is Professor S.F. Matsinhe, all the way from Mozambique. Professor S.F. Matsinhe. So same last name, but different first names. I do not see the name on the screen. I'm assuming they were unable to join us. I will move on to the next person on the list. I have Emily Estelle from the American Enterprise Institute. Emily Estelle.
Hello. Okay, just give me a second to share.
All right, your time begins now. You have 10 minutes, please.
Great. All right, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thanks for bearing with me as I get set up here. So when I saw kind of the presentations that were before me and recognized just the sheer amount of expertise that was in this room, I decided to kind of try and zoom out and look at some of the larger trends. And since we had such a collection of experts on individual groups, countries, and regions, I decided that looking from perspective of my research that is on the global Salafi jihadi movement and also some of the policy angles from the US side of things would be a useful addition, particularly since the session so well articulated the core focus on the effects of these groups within Africa. So I'll also pull forward some of the themes that we've heard from the other speakers and try and draw out a few different implications, again, looking kind of the broader angle at the movement here. So a couple of main points that I will touch on this morning. One, from the perspective of Salafi jihadi groups, looking at Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State globally, Africa has become increasingly important. And when we talk about kind of growth or expansion, which is a theme, for example, that Mr. Lallali touched on and others, there are a couple different ways to understand that. So I want to get into that a little bit. We've already discussed to a degree how these groups operate and that it's far from a purely military issue. But I also want to talk about how the movement itself sees governance as a goal and what the implications are for policy. And then finally, trends looking forward and how some of the regional dynamics that are present are likely to shape the actions of Salafi jihadi groups. So to the first point, obviously everyone on this call knows that there's a long history for jihadist groups in Africa. And so some of the media coverage that tends to paint these as new things is obviously not accurate, but it is true that within the context of the Al-Qaeda and Islamic State organizations, there's been a growing focus on Africa. You can see it in the media. You can see it, the media from those groups. You can see it in the formation of new Islamic State provinces. Now, the timing of this is in part because the Islamic State especially, and Al-Qaeda to a degree, suffered pretty significant losses in some of their other theaters, particularly in the Middle East. And so there is an incentive for them to really emphasize, whatever footprint they could have or could try and claim in other locations, particularly in Africa. And this has continued. The most recent speech from Al-Qaeda's leader really focused on the actions of Al-Shabaab and of JNIM in Mali. And that's a continuing theme for leadership statements from Al-Qaeda. A couple of key themes that this slide's meant to draw out. There are interconnections and relationships not only between jihadist organizations on the continent, but also connecting to other places. Again, not news, but noteworthy because of the sharing and the collaboration that goes on kind of across national or across continental lines. These different groups can reinforce each other. We've seen this, for example, in the development of Al-Shabaab over time, which has gained some capabilities, particularly through its relationship with Al-Qaeda in Yemen. One of the questions going forward, as we ask kind of where the dominant Salafi jihadi groups in the movement will end up, is how some of the organizations inside Africa that are now quite established may also reinforce jihadist groups elsewhere that have kind of lost a step. So the question of whether that flow goes both directions is a very live one. Another dynamic that this graphic gets to is what's the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. And for those who've been following this, you know that it's quite an antagonistic relationship in most cases now. And some of that dynamic is playing out in West Africa especially, but also elsewhere on the continent. And that will shape how those two organizations interrelate to each other globally as well, not just in the local context. So talking about the local global debate, there's and constant ongoing arguments about whether these kinds of groups really have kind of global or international ambitions, or whether they have local ambitions. And as with most complicated things, the answer, of course, it's almost always a little bit of both. And most people who study this closely, of course, recognize this, as you all know. But I think it's important to draw out what that local global tension actually looks like. So for groups like Shabab, like JNAM, especially the kind of more established groups compared to, say, some of the newer groups like the one in Mozambique, they have both local and global dimensions. They have local origins, and they're exploiting local grievances, and each group varies in its individual capabilities, how it's operating, what the connections are, etc. But the connection to the international movement does matter. That doesn't mean that kind of each jihadist group that declares itself in Africa or elsewhere is a carbon copy of, ISIS in Syria. That's certainly not true, and that can usually be kind of alarmist and create a policy response that's not useful. But at the same time, it does actually matter when these groups kind of tie into a global network. Part of it is branding and recruitment, but there's kind of a deeper level of change than that. There's a tendency for groups that started out more locally to take on additional objectives, to change their target sets to a degree, to gain capabilities or funding from other organizations, become more lethal over time. And so that connection does matter. Another piece that's worth thinking about is, coming from the US policy angle, which shouldn't be the predominant policy angle, but does matter, is that the kind of transnational terror component of these organizations do still require a physical haven for a lot of reasons, for recruitment, for funding, for the time and space to develop bomb-making capabilities, form cohorts, train individuals, indoctrinate potential attackers. There's a decently large physical footprint to all of that, even for attacks that are going to happen farther afield. And so until the internet completely replaces the ability to do those things in a physical space, which it has not yet, physical havens do still matter for that kind of transnational attack threat as well. And of course, the reason that matters when we're looking at more localized insurgencies is that if they're hosting that international attack component, that can of course drive policy responses that might not be as focused on the local dimensions as would actually be necessary, as we've seen before. I'll keep moving along quickly. A few main ideas I want to call out just for this group as you're considering trends going forward is that the Salafi jihadi movement globally is in quite a period of transition, and some of those transitions will have an effect on how local organizations operate, especially if they're taking guidance from, say, Al-Qaeda leadership. So we're in a period where we've had or will soon have leadership turnover at the tops of the global jihadist organizations. And those organizations are also in a period of trying to kind of synthesize their lessons learned, following the rise and fall of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and now the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. As you watch the jihadist chatter on this, there's a reckoning going on about how significant these events are and what they say about strategy. And what we've seen in the past in earlier stages is that sometimes these groups will shift their strategic approach and what they emphasize in which phase based on lessons learned from these kind of watershed events. And so we're in a period of waiting to see how these groups interpret these things and whether that means, as I think it will, that they're going to kind of double down on the localized approach that we've seen, particularly from the Al-Qaeda affiliates. So meaning, continuing the strategy that we're seeing with particularly Al-Shabaab and JNIM and Islamic State West Africa to a degree that's focused on consolidating that local position and walking that line between enforcing their will over the population and trying to provide a level of governance that might not always be available. Go over this pretty quickly because I think we've already touched it. The goal of these groups, of course, is not conducting attacks. That's a means to an end. And what they're trying to do is destroy and replace the governance structures that are available through a combination of coercion and outcompeting weak alternatives. One example that I looked into in the past. We've talked a little bit about Burkina Faso today. And so in the northern Burkina Faso case, that was one example of how militants have been able to combine that use of violence with appeals to local grievances and to kind of changing or implementing social policies. Returning to the theme of expansion, and I'll get to wrap up soon because I know I'm at about 10 minutes. When we talk about expansion and how significant it is, I want to recognize that there are gains and losses there. For example, if we look at AQIM in West Africa, there has been obviously this kind of massive shift to the south and into the Sahel. At the same time, AQIM as an organization has weakened, particularly in Algeria. And so drawing that distinction between what individual groups do and the movement broadly as new groups come up and names change, I think is important. It's easy to get fixated on the individual organizations, but that doesn't mean that things are actually trending well. And on a final note, there are a couple of major trends that will shape what opportunities are available for jihadist groups. The fragility of states generally, the potential for conflict, whether or not jihadists are actually involved in that conflict is a significant one. One thing that I'm watching out for is kind of what are the regional effects of the conflict going on in Ethiopia, and will that spill over in ways that worsens the security situation in countries that are dealing with a jihadist insurgency. And then a final point to make is that this isn't all about what African states are doing. There's also external players that come in and tend to make things more complicated. So the overlay of geopolitical competition or proxy, even proxy armed competition in different cases. Wagner Group came up for Mali, but also watching Libya and then some of the rivalries that have played out in Somalia. Those extra regional conflicts can also have an effect on what the counterterrorism operations are, kind of how government stability is progressing generally. So we need to make sure we're looking at multiple lenses of analysis, not just what jihadist groups themselves are doing as we try and forecast how strong or weak they're going to be in the future. So I will stop there. Apologies if I went a little bit over, but that's everything for me.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Emily Estelle. We'll now go back to Dr. Mohammed Hussein Gahas. Do we have Dr. Gahas's presentation?
Yes, thank you so much. Apologies for the technical issues that I have faced. So now sorry. I will share my screen. I hope you can see now.
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay. Is it quite clear enough? You know, the screen I share.
You want to use the presentation mode.
Yeah, okay.
You have exited the screen sharing option.
Yeah, I'm just trying to fix the presentation. Okay. Yes, now I'm sharing. I'm sorry, I faced some technicalities, some problems with my internet connection, and that was what contributed to this. I hope now you can see quite clearly.
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
What I will do is, because of the importance of Al-Shabaab in terms of as a terror group, as an insurgency group, which is contributing much of the stability in the Horn of Africa. Because of, the Horn of Africa in a way has always had some security challenges, and it has a kind of a system of insecurity that connects different states in the region. So when you have an insurgency in one country, it may spill over in other countries. And we have seen already Al-Shabaab conducting some attacks in Kenya, in Uganda, possibly in Tanzania. That's why I just try to contain my presentation on Al-Shabaab. This presentation will examine the counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency, specifically with regard to Al-Shabaab in Somalia, an organization that proves to be highly potent threat to the country, but also to the wider Horn of Africa. This presentation, I will try to attend to talk about the evolution of Al-Shabaab, its current status, modus of operandi, and also, you know, counter-terrorism strategies that have been adopted and used with regard to Al-Shabaab. And then I will conclude, you know, what one can do with regard to making those strategies, or counter-terrorism strategies, or countering Al-Shabaab more effective. Al-Shabaab has always Al-Shabaab went into different phases. Initially, it has been a very small network. Most of the individuals in that network, they belonged to a group of veterans from Afghanistan that has participated the Afghanistan, you know, jihad against the Soviet Union around 80s. So those individuals, they came back, they created a network, like-minded network, just maybe up to 5, 10, maximum 50. And then because of Somalia had problems of state collapse, civil war, and then the warlords taking over the country and dividing it into very small enclaves, you know, political, whatever, warlord enclaves, with a lot of roadblocks and extortion and abuses against civilians. By 2005, at the end of 2005, there has been a rendition conducted by the warlords, funded by the CIA. And this has provoked some sort of backlash from the civilian population, especially in Mogadishu. Parallel to this development, you had through time, since 1991 until 2006, you had local Sharia courts. Those local Sharia courts were not united. They were based on respective neighborhoods. Each neighborhood, prominent individuals started to resort parallel to the warlords, you know, some sort of courts, so that they could have some sort of law and order, you know, some sort of measure to curb criminality and killing and all of this. But then by the end of 2005, Islamic courts, although still localized and not united, located in different parts of the country, especially South Central Somalia, they grow their power, their popularity within the context that Somalia was at that time, which was a kind of disorder and chaos and warlordism. And then they have to come in conflict with the warlords around 2006. And because of the hatred of the civilian population, or larger part of the Somali population over the warlord rule, business individuals, civil society individuals, the large part of the population, they sided with the Islamic courts so that they can get rid of the warlords. Islamic courts captured most of Somalia, South Central Somalia, by mid-2006. And Al-Shabaab was part of the Islamic courts, responsible for guarding and for making security provisions in certain areas. Then you had an Ethiopian invasion to remove the Islamic courts with the US and Western support. From there, then again, Al-Shabaab emerged as a more radical and extreme group. And with the deployment with the withdrawal of the Ethiopian troops, they recaptured larger parts of South Central Somalia, then even including parts of Mogadishu. Then you had the TFG, Transitional Federal Government, that was excited at that time. It returned, and UN Security Council and African Union has to mandate the African Peacekeeping Mission Initially, it started with the Ugandan peacekeeping troops. Over time, between 2009 and 2010, up to 11, 12, 13, AMISOM was able to drive out Al-Shabaab from major urban areas. Yeah, and then as Al-Shabaab has been driven outside of major urban areas, more and more so, and as they started to implement their very harsh justice system, which was alien to the larger, to the Somali population, more and more Somalis started to distance themselves and oppose them. But then over time, Al-Shabaab, you know, also has to face drone attacks that targeted their leaders. You know, successive Al-Shabaab leaders has been killed by drone attacks. And for also, it faced by 2010, it has faced some sort of internal fragmentation where you had the Shura Council disagreeing on the orientation of the organization, on the use of suicide bombing, on the use of improvised explosive devices on heavily populated areas. And then with that kind of fragmentation, Al-Shabaab survived and was able actually to get rid of members of the Shura Council that was opposing. But also it has killed part of its international jihadists that were very important, like this American guy and several other guys that were in the rank of Al-Shabaab, and were very helpful in terms of Al-Shabaab media strategy. So in that sense, Al-Shabaab faced AMISOM over time, which became around 20,000 something, local population resenting against them, international, you know, pressure to drain their funding and finance systems, but also it has faced drone attacks. Then the question becomes how Al-Shabaab continue to survive and still controls larger territories within Somalia. Maybe it controls up to 30 or 40% of the country in the rural areas, and also the roads that contact different regions of the country. An answer to this is, you know, it adapted to the local context. It administratively, where initially it was highly centralized, but then it decentralized itself, giving different commanders some sort of autonomy to take decisions, to wage war. It intensified its reliance on assassinations and asymmetric warfare, suicide bombing, to maximize you know, fear among the local population, and also to project this image of being very lethal, very ruthless. And also it adapted very advanced, as several of my colleagues has mentioned elsewhere, very advanced media strategy, propaganda media strategy, where it amplified different mistakes or errors within the AMISOM, especially, for example, and the federal government. For example, if there is a civilian casualty as a collateral damage from AMISOM troops or from the drone attacks, Al-Shabaab goes after and tries to take an opportunity on that, but also it enforced a transparent justice system, which is very ruthless, but that delivers justice to the local population better than the federal government. On the top of that, one of the main reasons that it continues to be resilient is also the fact that you have a lot of political tensions and a lot of fighting within the political leadership between the federal state and the regional states, but also you have, for example, now you have the election being delayed.
Dr. Gahas, I'm afraid I really do have to respectfully stop you at this point. We are totally out of time. I appreciate your understanding on that. Thank you so much. I hope that we're able to go on to Q&A.
But can I finish? Just this slide.
I can give you 30 seconds, but no more.
Yeah, very good. So the status of the countering Al-Shabaab, you know, as far as today is concerned, and for the last 10 or so years, you know, it lacked a very important elements to be successful. Number one is it's not based on the context. It relies heavily on militarization. Also, you know, there is a constant political tension. And my understanding is that, you know, whatever future, this point is a recommendation, whatever future counterinsurgency or countering strategy to counter Al-Shabaab should be context tolerant, you know, based on the context in Somalia, not a theoretical thing. There should be a security sector reform, especially in Somalia, especially after what has been happening in Afghanistan. And I think one should try to strengthen local institutions and also attend to the needs of the population. You know, you cannot have an army or international engagement that is holistic, militaristic, and does not have civilian and other components that the mission would need. So I end my presentation here, and thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Gahas. Kindly unshare your screen at this point. I'd like to seek the consent of the moderator, the overall moderator, Professor Sami. Do we have time for Q&A?
I believe we can. Let me see. I mean, in the next session, we don't have many speakers, as I can see on my on the latest program. If Arinola can confirm this, we could take maybe another 10 minutes. Ms. Bello, are you here? Oh, seems like we've lost her. So yeah. Why don't you go ahead, Chair, and you know, open it up maybe for about 10 minutes or so.
All right, wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the floor is open to all participants. If you have any questions, kindly use the reaction button in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and I will look at those who have indicated and try to call on people in the order in which they appear before me. Mr. Raf Bello Fadile, your hand has been up for a long time. I don't know if that's an error, if you all the while intended to ask a question. So we would absolutely have to call you first, given how long your virtual hand has been up.
Thank you very much. I've been anxious to talk.
Fantastic. Please go for it. Let's make the comment.
I just want to raise some questions on what has been said about Boko Haram in Nigeria. First point, which I'm going to base my other issues on, is you have a driver of a vehicle and people are asking the passengers of the vehicle what is going on with the vehicle. In other words, all efforts in finding what is going on with Boko Haram have been directed towards the wrong source or wrong people. I do know that in the Office of the National Security Advisor, there's a general heading the counter-terrorism fight of Nigeria. Nobody ever talks to that general or what is going on with Boko Haram. Number two, nobody ever talks about the source. Why do we have Boko Haram today? Forgetting how it started in Yobe, it was neutralized. Muhammad Yusuf, who happens to be my client or our client, who are his lawyer, how he was killed and what happened thereafter. Number three, a lot of people have to forget how the fight against Boko Haram during President Jonathan's fight became partisan. Whatever that government did, the oppositions and some Western countries were against it. Nobody ever thought, how did he manage within 4 weeks to retake 14 local governments from Boko Haram and conducted the election? And what do we have thereafter? Nobody ever talked about that. Then you also have the questions of weapons. I do know at the time of during Jonathan's era, we do have enough weapons, even though there was embargo on selling weapons to Nigeria, to his government, as a matter of fact. And his government had to resort to foreign help, like every other people do, using foreign companies, security companies to help fight the war. What happens after that? And then there's this perception, that's my last point I'm going to make. There's this perception that there's $2 billion that was approved for purchase of arms. That is not true. I do know, I work with the National Assembly to approve a loan to buy weapons. That loan was never used. It emanated from a negotiation with Belarus to supply arms and then government pay later. Then the Minister of Finance then said that is a loan. That's Ngozi Nwela, who is now the DG of World Trade Organization. He said that would be a loan. And so the ministry cannot, the government cannot do that. We have to go back to the National Assembly, which was done. Now, those are parts that are there, but nobody ever talks about it. And that is why we have what we have today.
All right.
Boko Haram. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bello Fadile. So I'm going to turn things over to my co-panelists. I do have, my response to that, but I would privilege the response of my co-panelists on that. So if any of the panelists would like to speak to Mr. Bello Fadile's comment, that would be wonderful. Any takers? Okay, Dr. Olojo, please go for it.
Oh, thank you very much. No, I agree completely with what has been raised. I mean, thank you very much, sir. The points you have mentioned, both historical as well as the ones that have served as catalysts along the way, are very critical ones that have contributed to what we're witnessing, not only in Nigeria, but what is also now a regional problem affecting the neighboring countries. You mentioned the accountability of leadership. I agree with you. We must ask questions at the highest levels. We must ask questions at the National Assembly, direct questions to the various levels of leadership, and also call all these to account, because one way or the other, they have a role to play in terms of how best to respond. And what you said about how asking the passengers of a vehicle is really should be the other way around. We should be asking the driver of the vehicle, even though, of course, we know that this must be a whole of society approach. And of course, what you said about the extrajudicial killing of Mohammed Yusuf, 2009, when this happened, it changed everything. The situation became even more compounded. And that is what we're looking at today, the consequences of how this has been mismanaged. So we can go on. And I mean, I simply just want to agree with you and just say that there is a lot of mileage to cover and a lot of work to be done, and it will not be solved overnight. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Olojo. General Ishola Williams, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I just want to make 2 points. Number one is that people tend to believe that either Boko Haram or ISWAP, they are not sure about their political objectives. They have political objectives. And my own, assessment of the situation for the past 10 years is that they want to capture Borno State. They are not interested in other states. Neither interested in crossing River Niger to come to the south. They want to make Borno State, where the majority of the Boko Haram people come from, the Kanuris, as a caliphate. Therefore, they are getting some form of support from the community, the Kanuri community, and the government, and even the traditional rulers of that community, the Kanuri ethno group, have not been able to disengage the Kanuri people from Boko Haram. That's number one. Number two is that apart from all the things that have been said, two aspects do come up from your own paper, from Akin, Olojo and co. And I like particularly the connection made by Dr. Benoni, Theroux Benoni, between West and Central Africa. Very important, very key. But ECOWAS and ICAS do not understand that, and therefore they are not working together. They had a meeting once, many years ago. People in Africa don't work together. As a former general in the army, is this. First of all, the role that should be played by the political authority, especially the National Security Advisor and the community and the Commander-in-Chief, they are not living up to expectation. We are going into this insurgency without any strategic plan. Two, the military itself have no operational doctrine. And three, therefore, because they don't have that, they have no tactics. And therefore, they cannot structure the organization to be able to deal militarily with what we are facing in the whole of Lake Chad and even in the Sahel. And because the military in Africa, as expressed by the foreign minister at the UN of Mali, foreign minister of Mali, that the French are not protecting them. We believe that if we cannot protect ourselves, Europe, America, and everybody else, according to the UN Charter, must be ready to take on responsibility. And therefore, we should not bother. And we do not question, quickly, we do not question why the conflict in Congo has been going on for the past 60 years, and we are not able to do anything there. The case of Mali too is going on. Central African Republic. Africans are not thinking. They are not thinking doctrinarily, operational tactically, and otherwise. So we can talk about everything you can talk about. You need capable of at least degrading development to take place. Thank you.
Thank you, General Williams. I do not see any other hands, and therefore I would like to appreciate each and every one of you for being part of the panel. There's a lot of takeaway from the conversation so far. I'm not going to overflog any of those because we are totally out of time. I will simply yield to our host and moderator-in-chief, Professor Sami. Over to you, Professor Sami.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oriola, for moderating this previous session. Is Dr. Okereke on the call today? Oh, there you are. Okay, I just saw you.
Yes, I'm on. Just a minute.
Oh, okay.
All right. Hello. Yeah, good evening.
Dr. Gula, no, there. I saw him this morning.
Yes, I'm here. I can't hear anyone calling my name, so maybe it's a problem from this side. Okay, I'm here. Yeah. You want me to start?
I think the person moderating this session is Dr. Okereke. I don't know if he's still.
Yes, that's my concern.
I think he's frozen. Let's see. He was here. I think he's running into some technical issues.
Guess as much.
Well, maybe why don't you start then? Hopefully he will be able to come in. Right. So this session is on intelligence, counterintelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So there's a lot of things in there, early warning as well, and so current and future trends. So why don't you make your presentation, Dr. Ogunlana? And if he can't come in, I will moderate the discussion afterwards. Right, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Let me quickly share my screen. And there's no way we talk about intelligence, counterintelligence without touching the issue of insurgent and terrorism, and also brush on some of the things that has been mentioned here. Once again, my name is Oludare Ogunlana. So I'm a professor of cybersecurity in Texas. And at the same time, I am a member of Council for African Security Affairs, working directly with Colonel Rafadide. I'm honored to be here. Can you all see my screen, please?
Yes.
All right. If you can see my screen, that's fine. Well, I like this man. You know, he said, in the midst of chaos, there's also opportunity, and victory comes from finding opportunities in problem. And I think in the last 30 years or so, and for Nigeria in the last 15 years, we must have seen that we have opportunity to build that kind of capability, which of course will make us be able to confront the problem of today and whatever we face in future. But like General Williams said, I don't think Africa we're thinking. So I don't think we're going towards that part. And that's my concern. And that's why the title, whatever I want to discuss here today, is going to be around how did this happen and how can we prevent it from happening again? Because that's the purpose of being here. And we do that by understanding our new enemy. You know, what do we know about them? It's part of intelligence as well. You know, from Tuareg separatist movement in Mali to Ambazonia Defense Forces in Cameroon, and to terrorist organization, which of course has been operating in Nigeria for more than a decade, Boko Haram in Nigeria, and also what we see in Burkina Faso in recent time. I just I saw BBC News on the 24th September that more than 70 people have been arrested in Burkina Faso in connection with money laundering and funding of armed groups in that place. And part of the problem also is that how do we define them? How do we separate those who are fighting freedom fighter from terrorist organization? We have IPOB in Nigeria, of course. Probably government will call them terrorist organization, but I don't see them as terrorist organization from academia perspective. And what's going on in Cameroon also, but government is going to label them as a terrorist organization, whereas what they are doing, what they are saying is, okay, give us some freedom, deepen our democracy. Why do we have somebody living there, being a president for more than 30 years and generation upon generation? They've never seen any changes in that. And I don't see what African Union is doing about it. And I will touch on that as well. Then I focus on from academic perspective, what we know of terrorist organization and what we know about them. And like Konefadile mentioned, from 2001, Yusuf Indoctrination Center on attacking the government policy, the 3 tiers of Nigerian government policy, federal, local government, state, and it cleverly and eloquently capitalized on the prevailing socio-economic situation in Maiduguri, to appeal and win the mind of the populace, especially the youth. General William just mentioned it, that these people, they have political objective, they are control. They want to control part of Nigeria. They want to install caliphate in that place. So having won a substantial number of disciples in their thousands, so Yusuf introduced the doctrine of jihad and martyrdom. And to date, members of the group, they have the belief that if they die in the course of fighting their jihad, they will go straight to heaven. I mean, that's part of the indoctrination. And he used Quran as justification to conduct jihad against infidels or non-believers. And Yusuf built a kind of dynamic and military organization in Nigeria today. We don't even know what to do with them. Now they can train, use recruit against a far more ambitious target. No, he rallied a new sellout with new money, with each demonstration of Boko Haram capability. So today, Boko Haram forged a close alliance with ISIS. They call themselves ISWAP, right? So as of today, what we know about them, they have leaders who, of course, can evaluate, approve, and supervise planning and direction of any major operation in Nigeria. Now, they're operating as bandits in Northwest. They have personnel systems that could recruit candidates, indoctrinate them, vet them, and give them the necessary training. So they have a sufficient communication to enable them plan and direct operation anyway, without anybody helping them. So they have intelligence effort, which of course they can gather required information and form assessment of the enemy's strength and weaknesses of Nigerian military. And also they have the ability to move people to great distance, the ability to raise money at every point in time. This guy, is the son of that Yusuf, Banawi, right? So, and we look at what happened. What do we see? We have been talking, is it policy failure or intelligence failure? I would say the combination of the two. So it seems our leaders at some point, they don't understand intelligence. General William will recall the first time when these people broke jail, when they break into prison, instead of us to look at it holistically, I think President Yaradras at that time was going to Saudi Arabia and he just gave information to kill all of them. I think they killed substantial amount of them at that time, but I know, despite all the open source intelligence and the advice from British intelligence that, okay, these people are not common criminals, it's going to be very difficult dealing with them this way. I don't know, probably our leaders, they don't, based on their policy, they don't understand intelligence or they don't have policy for that. We underestimated them. We never knew they are going to get to where they got to today. We underestimated their capability. We didn't look at it from the point that they can use religion, which of course they take advantage of the problem, which of course we have in Nigeria at that time, to advance their cause. So we have this confidence, overconfidence. Our military can defeat them. They are just ragtag soldiers. So, and complacency on the side of the government and ignorance when people don't understand, when this thing happens, we don't really understand who they are. And the combination of all these is actually what led to where we are today. Combination of policy failure and intelligence failure, ignorance in particular, complacency and overconfidence. And looking at what we've seen so far in Africa, the cause of terrorism, as widely held belief within policy and practice, we agree that rough terrain and other physical obstacles to power projection in the public surveillance, lower counter-insurgency capability, and generally constitute a kind of fighter facilitator of rebellion. And that was what General was talking about the other time. Physical terrain, the Maiduguri Axis, Sambisa forest has been abandoned for so long time. The level of poverty in that place is so bad, and people don't even have opportunity to be able to access power. And also we have this kind of human geography, so socio-cultural inaccessibility, when people they don't have access to opportunity, when things are so, they could not even have access to government, they don't have access to any kind of good thing in their life. So all those things constitute what causes rebellion. And in choosing where to start that from what we know, don't forget the Manual of Warfare written by the Argentine Marxist Revolutionary Guevara, which of course followed the doctrine of guerrilla warfare. It says, okay, when you choose a kind of zone difficult to reach, either because of dense forest or steep mountain, impassable desert, or matches, then it's going to be, you are going to win your battle. And they chose Sambisa Forest, where that has been abandoned for so long time. And apart from physical obstacles, socio-cultural inaccessibility, which of course form a significant issue in our society today, the problem is the same in Nigeria, to Mali, to DRC Congo, to Mozambique, to Sudan, to Burkina Faso, and Niger Republic. So the critical aspect of human geography, which of course that we should consider that contributing factor to this insurgency and terrorism in that sub-region, the ethnic diversity and characteristic of the local population, their political status, and so on and so forth. So moving on, because I don't know how much how long I've gone. So I think, okay. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, it's easy for any government to say, okay, for those who are agitating for their freedom, asking for good thing, these guys are terrorists. Those who want to contest power for political or religious change, and government that want to maintain power have used terror to instill fear in people, and we've seen that. And I've not seen AU doing so much about what we see, you know, in that region. Terrorism is not new, and this phenomenon has been as long history, and it's going to be with us for so long time. So now, what we've seen from our own research, because of this insurgency or terrorism, so there are two different in any way, we've seen desire for change. People are looking, you know, for better life. They want their vote to be counted. They don't want to contest. They don't want to vote and the election rigged. So desire for change breed that kind of rebellion, whether they become terrorists or not. Religion, when you start giving a kind of extreme ideology, you know, catching them from young. If you look at most part of northern part of Nigeria, I focus on Nigeria because that's I have understanding what's going on in some part of the country where you don't allow them to go to school, where there's so much poverty. Instead of sending them to proper school, you send them to madrasa, where one malam will start teaching them what they should know is going to make them what they become. Anyway, symbolic. October 1st, 2010, you know, the main group.
Dr.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you can conclude maybe in 4 or 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll be done in 4 or 5 minutes. So we've seen revenge, we've seen political motive, we've seen social injustice as part of what is causing all this problem. So, but more emphasis has been laid on the violent side of terrorism. No, we talk more about the activities of the terrorist and separatist group without talking about the causation and understanding what caused all these things. We'll be able to understand the gap and come up with strategy. First, part of the strategy of combating that would be championing aspiration for human dignity. Are we living a kind of dignified life in that region? Strengthen alliance to defeat terrorism and work to prevent attack against our friends, us and our friends as well. We work with other countries, to diffuse regional conflict, like General mentioned, develop agenda for cooperation, action, which of course will center with great power, transform African national security institution to meet the challenges and opportunity of 21st century. And also we have to engage the opportunity of confronting challenges of globalization. So my strategy will still continue, emphasis on the need to engage actively in war of ideas, to combat and counter the dissemination of terrorist group. So international cooperation will establish a kind of procedure to protect our homeland, disable terrorist network, then call for utilization of all elements of power. When we approach terrorism in Nigeria in the first, we use military approach. The FBI has been fighting terrorism since 1909. They have been using diplomatic approach, economic approach, law enforcement, financial, intelligence, military, and information dissemination, because fighting terrorism is just semi-military approach. So we must transform our intelligence capability and build new ones to keep pace with the nature of this threat, which of course we face today. And intelligence must be appropriately integrated with our defense and law enforcement system. We must strengthen intelligence warning and analysis to provide integrated threat assessment for national homeland security. I call it homeland security. And question for every one of you here, should we integrate repentant terrorists into our security institution, like what is going on in Nigeria for now? What I would say from academic point of view and practice, that it should be no. You can integrate them into the society, but I would not want the repentant Boko Haram to go back into our military, into our law enforcement. It's going to be a kind of wrong approach. So, and we know from history that deterrence can fail, and we know from experience that some enemies cannot be deterred, and that's why you should not get them into your security system. So to defeat this threat, we must make use of every tool, like I've mentioned earlier on, military power, better homeland defenses, law enforcement, intelligence, and vigorous effort. It should be everything on the table. And intelligence and how we use it is our first line of defense against terrorist organization. And I like Nixon principle, which of course stated, I like his principle. It's not as comprehensive as that of Clinton, but we can buy from that on how to stop insurgency and terrorism in Africa. We have to reject terrorism in all bases. We don't need to appoint somebody who's tainted with terrorism into the government as a minister. No, we have to demonstrate leadership by example in terms of diplomacy. We have to seek effective prosecution. Today, up to today, I've not been able to see anyone being prosecuted for terrorism in Nigeria. Rather, we focus our attention on arresting those who are the freedom fighters, those who are saying, okay, we want change. So nobody has been prosecuted, apart from the Jonathan government, where even a serving minister was arrested, a serving senator was arrested. So I've never seen that, and up to today. So we must not make any concession in such a way that we have to be paying ransom to those criminals, to those bandits. So we can only end that by our commitment to the rule of law. We must have a common definition of terrorism, not that one is convenient for government to ponder some people and say, oh, they are terrorists. So we must have common definition of that. And deed must equal to word. If you say we are going to deal with terrorists, we must deal with them. And we must understand also that there's no simple solution. The government and our public must understand and realize that terrorism has been around for so long time. It's going to be with us. There's not going to be any magic bullet, and there's not going to be any easy solution. We are going to do this one, and there's not going to be any clean victory. With this, I will end my submission. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ogunlana, and apologies that I was trying to force you to rush in the end.
And that's fine.
But we are at 12:28 right now, so technically we should be ending this session in 2 minutes. But I do want to give people the chance to ask a couple of questions, maybe for the next 5 minutes or so. So whoever wants to ask a question, just please open your mics and speak. Who has a question? I don't see anyone. Okay, so I'm gonna close this session then. So let me thank the speaker for his presentation. And now I'm gonna turn things over to Mr. Hubert Kahuzi, if he's on the call, to moderate this next session. Is he here? Miss Bello, are you here? Can you let me know what we should do next?
Professor Sami, I'm here.
Okay. So
I have to
who
change
is
my phone because we're having network issues where
okay.
Yeah. Dr. Kireke is also here. I can't see.
Okay, I'm here. I'm here. I'm presenting.
Okay, wonderful. And
right, thank you very much.
And do we have Colonel Puyi on the call?
Yes, I'm here, Chair, and I raise my hand to explain why Mr. Kaoud is not around.
Okay.
It's because a problem of language. He is a French speaker and he doesn't understand English.
Okay, I see what you mean. Okay, well, then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Okereke then as our starting speaker.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have sent my paper by email. I'm having a problem trying to share it from this area so they can collect and share from that side. Let me get with the presentation. You can check now, I sent it by email some minutes ago, just some few seconds ago. All right. Now, I'm to speak on the strengths and weaknesses of African militaries and paramilitaries in counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency operations in Africa, and the role of think tanks and military training institutions. Now, as a matter of introduction, I just observed that in the last decades, Africa has been fraught with several incidents of armed violence. At the point that there was a reduction in the scourge of conflicts, but between 2018 and 2019, there has been a kind of astronomical rise in the incidence of armed conflict, as observed by the AU-CAERT. In 2018, 15,873 conflict incidents were recorded, while in 2019, over 21,000 incidents were recorded. This shows a significant rise in the conflict data within the periodic review and calls to question the African Union Agenda 2063, especially as the aspiration of silencing the guns by the year 2020 has proved unrealistic. Now, furthermore, the CIPRI observed that not less than 15 African countries have been posing various forms of conflict since 2019. Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Kenya, Mali, Mozambique, Niger, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and even Sudan. These are epicenters of armed conflict in the continent. Now, for me, the basic deduction at this point is, so long as the armed conflict persists, there will be sustained deployment of the militaries of affected African countries to combat operations. They could be in the form of international security operations, or peace support operations, or insurgency and counter-insurgency operations. Now, this presentation examines the strengths and weaknesses of African militaries in counter-insurgency operation and counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency operations, with a view to highlighting the role for military training institutions and think tanks alike. I work at National Defense College in Nigeria, and this is a strategic level institution for training top-level military manpower as its main mandate. Now, I try to put up a map showing the nature of conflicts in Africa and the countries that are presently affected or affected in the past decades, then the nature of deployments. In terms of terrorism, insurgency, and banditry, you can see Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, DR Congo, Mali, Egypt, Mozambique, Nigeria, Somalia are involved. And the nature of deployment are focused basically at counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency. With regard to communal conflicts, including pastoralist farmers' violence, Nigeria is central. The incidents have been on increase in Nigeria in the past decade, especially in the last 6 years. Mali and Niger are also affected by this. Then, and the nature of military engagement and paramilitary tend to assume the form of internal security operations. Now, for the maritime domain, piracy and other maritime security threats, sea robbery. Now, the Gulf of Guinea, countries in the Gulf of Guinea and countries in the Gulf of Aden. I know the Gulf of Guinea all the way from Senegal through Liberia, Ghana, Nigeria, up to Angola, West Central Africa and Southern Africa are involved up to Angola. So generally, the engagement of the various navies is in maritime domain awareness and protection. But one thing is obvious: the navies in these countries appear weak. Some of the countries don't have, like Liberia, don't have navy entirely. What they have is Coast Guard. Some countries' navy don't have adequate naval access to engage the maritime domain awareness and surveillance. Now, with regards to rebellions and secessionist agitations, Nigeria, Cameroon, because Nigeria, we have issues of the independent people of Biafra trying to demand the actualization of Biafran aspiration. Then in Cameroon, the Southern Cameroon ambassadors, former British Southern Cameroons, are demanding for independence for Ambazonia. With regards to Ethiopia, they are doing the Tigray People Liberation Front, have been engaging the government, the federal troops since November last year, and that persists. With Mali, the historical demand for Azawad persists, and that throws up several challenges that require military engagement. And then you have counter-insurgency operations there. Chad, in fact, just before the president, the former head of state, Idriss died. In fact, Chad has been involved in civil war since even for decades. And more importantly, the Forces for Alliance and Concord in Chad began their own aggression in 2017, and now persisted to date. Central African Republic, DR Congo have their histories of armed conflict persisting. Since 2013, Central African Republic have been boiling. DR Congo has lasted over 5 decades. So the counter-insurgency operation exists. Then the incidence of military coup seem to be assuming new relevance in new presence in the continent. In 2012 or thereabout, we had Egypt, Mali have had about, in the past 5 years, or in the past decade, about 3 different military coups in Mali. Burkina Faso had its own, and then Guinea-Conakry recently. And the nature of deployment is overthrow of the political leadership in the country. Now, with regards to the aspect of strength and weakness of the military, I look at it strictly from the angle of just the citizen and the states. For the military, their strengths, from my own perspective now, and their weaknesses lies on the citizens and the states. States, bearing in mind the issue of constitutionalism, the political system, the respect for the constitution, a situation whereby the rules of engagement are played and there is limited government within the rules of the constitution is very, very key in engaging the military. Now, why I say this is that in terms of the constitution, whereby there is military subordination to civil power, is very, very unique to the extent that the civil power itself keeps the rules of engagement. You would have called recently the episode in Guinea-Conakry. The former president tried to alter the constitution for a third term, and that against popular aspiration, and the military leverage on that to intervene. So keeping to the constitution by the political class, by the citizens is key. And also the military keeping to the constitutional provision for the military, very, very key. Then the definition of the direction of security as spelled out in the national security policy and strategy is very, very key. The national security policy defines the trust of the country, and also defines, even from there, the national defense policy, the Armed Forces Act, take their own formation. So the national security policy determines how the government, even the political leadership, should go about pursuing the conduct of governance. With regards to the defense policy now specifically to how the military will be deployed, it flows from national security policy. So when these things are clearly spelled out, the nature and the trust determine the role of the military and how strong or how weak the military will be. If you have a policy that is that is excessively repressive, it tends to stimulate resentment and repression and civil disobedience. Then the pact between the military and the citizens, we have a fraction. Armed Forces Act exists to define the conduct of those in the military. The nature of politics, the governance indicators. Now, whereby the government with regards to African country and from experience, whereby the development needs are adequately met, you see population being solidly behind the government. But whereby these governance indicators are not being addressed effectively, whereby the nature of politics is like a kind of brigandage, the state power where corruption and prebenda politics take over. There is a disconnect between the citizens and the state. The issue of loyalty from the citizens vary. If you look at what happened in Guinea recently, as why ECOWAS is screaming that the military suspending the military, the junta regime in ECOWAS in Guinea, the population is celebrating. So there is a disconnect. If the government is effectively meeting the needs and aspirations of the people, you see the population support it. But when the nature of politics is different, why corruption and high politics become the order of the day, there's a problem. I come to issue of the strength and weaknesses drawing from diplomacy. Now, if you look at Nigeria, or the countries in the Chad Basin area, or Nigeria's immediate neighbor, with regards to the Boko Haram, it became imperative that the Nigerian government, the Goodluck administration did that, and what administration was doing it. The Nigerian government had to engage the neighboring countries who are strategic neighbors. Now, the essence is what? Foster collaboration, adequate collaboration to address the mutual security challenge. Now, if the diplomacy is weak, there is a problem. When Cameroon was finding difficult to join the Joint Task Force, France, Holland invited the Chad Basin countries to France, the Paris conference, and they came there and agreed for the joint fight against Boko Haram. And they came back now and worked together. If I had Mike Cameron hosting one of the Chad Basin missions, the Chad Basin Commission's meeting towards evolving the concept of operation for the Moderator Joint Task Force that it was eventually came into existence in May 2015. Now, in terms of civil military cooperation, it's very, very simple that where the people have confidence in the military, that the military is not just a repressive instrument to coerce them, to subjugate them to whims and caprices of the political class. There is partnership, there is confidence, and they collaborate. You see, when you are fighting insurgency, it becomes easy to collaborate with the population. This is what happens in southern Cameroon. To a reasonable extent, the brutality of the Cameroon armed forces on the English-speaking region have tended to alienate some of the population from the government, and they now give support to the non-state armed group fighting for independent states of Amazonia. The activities of military tend to antagonize and get the people radicalized against the states. So whereby the military is not working in concert, the population will lose support for it, and military operation becomes extremely difficult, which leading to human rights violations and avoidable losses. With regards to equipment profile and combat effectiveness, this for me is just a function of the preceding issues I've tried to highlight. If those ones are consistent in line with patriotism and the goals of the state, and the population share it, and then the issue of corruption in the armed forces is addressed, issue of equipment profile and combat effectiveness will be strengthened. But whereby these things are not there, the military is exactly what countries that have had corruption in armed forces know how that affects their combat readiness and operational effectiveness. Now, with regards to the role of think tanks and military training institutions, for me, the core role of military training institutions and think tanks is to equip the capabilities of the armed forces personnel in the discharge of their core mandates, to what? Equip them, enhance their capabilities towards what? Discharge of their mandates. Now, this takes into cognizance of the caliber of personnel involved. Are they non-commissioned officers working on training the non-commissioned personnel receive? Now, even among the officer cadre, working on training goes to the tactical level of officers, operational level officers, and strategic level, and even including higher military organizations. The think tanks and military training institutions, they, depending on the mandate they are tasked to perform, try to what? Conduct researches and so as to find out ways of improving or carry out exercises, and then design programs, that curriculum that are targeted at the particular level of officers that they are targeted, they establish what attend to. This could be in terms of they could be staff officers or have command responsibilities. So these think tanks conduct research leading to policy and strategy needed for combat effectiveness and operational effectiveness of the armed forces. The utility of regimentation, discipline, and aggressiveness necessary for military professionalism are also inculcated through these military training institutions. To this end, can be added training relating to extant protocols and conventions on armed conflicts, rules of engagement, international humanitarian law, and laws of armed conflict. Now, finally, conclusion, I'm trying to conclude now. Drawing from the above reflections and experiences above, now from various countries in Africa, I tried to extract something with focusing on the current conflict in southern Cameroon and the conflict in Ethiopia. It appears the government, from my own assessment, that the government of both Cameroon and Ethiopia underestimated or miscalculated the capabilities of the foe. They felt that deploying military could address it within a matter of 1 or 2 months. But for the case of Ethiopia, it had lingered since November last year. In the case of Southern Cameroon, since November 2017, the armed conflict has intensified such that Cameroon is even looking for Nigeria to assist it through mutual patrols and joint operations to address its own internal security challenges. I'll rest my case at this point. Thank you very much. Hello.
Thank you so much, Dr. Emeka Okereke, for that beautiful presentation. May we call on Colonel M. Hui of the African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism to make his own presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a big challenge for me today to do for the first time a presentation in English. My presentation was prepared in French, so don't expect me to be eloquent. I will share my presentation with you now, and we will discuss some points. Can you see my presentation?
It's black.
Coming up, sir.
Oh, fine, great.
Okay. I was asked today to talk about strengths and weaknesses of armed forces and paramilitaries in the counter-insurgency and counter-terrorism in Africa, and also to talk about the role of think tanks and military institutions in charge of training. So my presentation will follow two main lines, two main arguments. The first argument is that the counter-insurgency and counter-terrorism to be effective should be based on the respect of the rule of law and the protection of civilian population. Why? Because the counter-insurgency and counter-terrorism are criticized and on these aspects. So to make it more effective, it will be better to found them on these two lines. And the second argument is that the armed forces and paramilitaries, while countering insurgency and terrorism, should permanently adapt. They should use more resources in intelligence collection, intelligence analysis, intelligence sharing. They should adapt their structures, their equipment, and their modus operandi. So to develop these two aspects, I have some talking points. First of all, to understand what is counter-insurgency and what is counter-terrorism, but I will not talk much about that since there were interesting discussions previously. I will also talk about principles and lessons learned from the history of counter-insurgency and counter-terrorism that will help us to understand maybe why our armed forces and paramilitaries are so weak in countering these two phenomena. I will also now present which is, from my perspective, the strengths of armed forces and paramilitaries and the weaknesses. And also talk, as asked, the role of military training, military institutions in charge of training in the enhancement of capacity building of armed forces, and also the role of how think tanks can contribute to enhance this capacity. And I will finish by talking about some recommendations that can improve capacities of our armed forces and paramilitaries. Okay, I took from lesson and principle learned from the history. There are many from a very interesting book that I can recommend, wrote by a specialist on counterinsurgency, David Galula, that was a French officer with a big experience in Algeria, in Latin America, and from all this experience, he drawn from some lessons that are very interesting. The first one is that acting as using the same methods like insurgent or terrorist group are using on the ground will help terrorist group, insurgent groups to quickly achieve their objectives. If they are not respecting laws, if they are violating human rights, and our armed forces also doing the same thing, it will be in the benefit of these groups. And we can look around us, do our armed forces or paramilitaries, how do they act on the ground? The second thing is that earlier you will start dealing with insurgency and terrorism, and better will be your success. So it is not recommended to wait until the situation will be very bad to start reacting. So it's important to put in place some early warning system to improve the intelligence mechanism to identify factors that can lead to the emergence of insurgency or terrorism. The third one is that the counter-terrorism or the counter-insurgency is what is called in French bataille d'arrêt. So it is a battle that needs to have troops in permanently on the area of action. There is no sense to send troops on the ground and after defeating one or two small groups in the area to withdraw, saying that we have purchased or we have destroyed the group. No, because after the military success on these groups, there are some activities to put in place to the population to regain confidence, to be more, to feel more secured. So it is not to put in place action, to go and back, but go and stay. And also the approach adopted, even if it is a military force, should not have only a military component, but also what are called civilian military actions. So sometimes in some areas, maybe we will need more doctors. Sometimes we will need maybe more social assistants. There are more troops. So the approach to be implemented should be adapted to the situation and integrate a range of measures that are not only military measures. And the next lesson that I think is very important and crucial for African armed forces and military is that the action should be conducted based on the unity of the command on intelligence and psychological action. You know that in the counter-insurgency and counter-terrorism, psychological action is very important. So we should have an integrated effort, an integrated component that will be leading the operation or the operation we are conducting. And also the final victory, the final success will be obtained by the destruction of the ideological, political, administrative structure and the military structure of the insurgents. So if you obtain only the military success and you didn't destroy the ideological corpus or the political corpus or what is on the basis of their claims, what found their violence, so it will be regenerated. You have to destroy the ideological, the political, the administrative, and the military apparat of the insurgents and terrorists. And also the physical destruction of insurgents or terrorists is not the aim. It cannot be constituted aim as it is, but it should be considered as a way to gain the support of the population, because in many cases the population is forced to support insurgents or terrorists because they fear for their lives, for their security. So when you destroy, you show that you can destroy these forces, it will help them to regain confidence. And so having the confidence of the population should be the main goal of our counter-insurgency action or counter-terrorist action. And this confidence is gained by obtaining what I can call a moral support from the population. So the moral support, to gain the moral support, we have also to put in place, to implement some actions that aim at showing a better picture for our forces and showing the bad aspects of the action of insurgents and terrorists. Sometimes, and depending of the conditions, it can be practically impossible to destroy all the military structure of the insurgents. So it is advised from these lessons to put them under pressure, so they could feel that they are not in security in the area, not give them space to move freely, to do what they want. And also that the counter-insurgency and counter-terrorism don't base on very big operations that can very rare, maybe 1 or 3 months after, because it's very complex to implement a very big operation. But it should be based on small operations, very targeted operations that are, let's say, permanent, and that will help not insurgents or terrorists to act as they want. And also, it's important not to focus on not to focus on the security of infrastructure, itineraries, because it will help insurgents or terrorists to identify where you are, and they will now, as we can see what's happening in northeast Nigeria, in DRC, they will identify where are troops, and they will not act in vacuum space where they are not. So it's better to carry out more patrols, to be everywhere in the area of action. So now I've said that. I will now move to what, in my understanding, from my perspective, are the strength of armed forces. So the first strength, in my understanding, is that armed forces can have a lot of large possibilities to collaborate and to use the existing political administrative structure in the area of action. They can use the administration, they can use all political, let's say, party organizations, structures that are there. They can involve them in what they want to achieve. The second strength is that the armed forces should have a superiority in the number of fighters. So there should be more soldiers in the army than in the insurgent group or the terrorist group. There should be more equipment and better equipment, more means to move from one place to another very quickly, and also better equipment of communication. And also armed forces should have better capacity to manage large spaces. And also they have better capacity to conduct operations involving all armies, you know, army, navy, if it's a country with a coast, and air forces. That is not the case for insurgent and terrorist groups. And also in the army, there should be a high sense of discipline. That is very important to obtain the success. They have better capacity to plan and coordinate their action. They have better possibility to renew their resources. Could be recruitment of financial resources or equipment, material resources. They have also the possibility, and we are seeing it more and more, to act in international coalitions, so they can even call support from for foreign armies if they feel that they are not capable to deal themselves. We can see now what's happening in Mozambique. And also in the armed forces, normally the national conscience is higher in insurgent groups or terrorist group. You'll have maybe religious conscience or something that is related to a certain community, a religious community or ethnic community or whatever community. But in the army, it's a national conscience. So the members of the armed forces are more conscious, and this conscience gives them, helps them to be more strong than terrorists. But at the same time, there are some weaknesses that are not small and that we have to work on. The first weakness is that there is a very weak capacity to ensure public security in the area affected. Usually, our armed forces are not capable to ensure the security even for the political administrative structure existing in the area. It's common to see that the insurgent group or the terrorist group, when they will want to control an area, they will start by targeting community leaders, political leaders. It is just to create the insecurity, so people will fear and start not trusting in the secure armed and security forces. The second weakness is the low capacity for intelligence. Intelligence, it is not very well not conducted or collected, analyzed. There are a lot of weaknesses that we have to work on. And also there is a very weak capacity to adapt. You can see even when we send troops on the ground, we don't think how the structuring of the troops we are sending is adapted to what they are going to do there. We will send a division, full division, as it is going to fight another division on the ground. So we have to adapt the structure, we have to adapt the equipment, we are even to adapt the tactics, the modus operandi to implement, because sometimes modus operandi that we implement can, instead of improving the situation, can worsen it again. And also there is, as I told before, a certain limit to the operational effectiveness. So when, for example, we conduct a battle against a terrorist group, an insurgent group, and we kill 1,100 or 200, and we occupy the terrain, what we do after? Usually, we withdraw troops, and they come again. So it will be like going and coming, and it limits our operational success. So we have also to see how to increase our success after obtaining a success or reoccupying, for example, a place that was occupied by terrorists. What should we do to maintain our presence there? So roles of military institutions in charge of capacity building, they have to develop and implement training programs that are adapted to the forces that will be engaged in counterinsurgency and counter-terrorism. They have also to improve the quality of programs in keeping a very close link between think tanks and research center and capacity building institutions by exchange of experts, by exchange of programs with even other regions and continents. We know, for example, that Latin America has a very good experience in counterinsurgency. Africa, that is now in countering insurgencies everywhere, can learn a lot from Latin America. As institutions in charge of capacity building can also be useful in developing and publishing training manuals on counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency, and also promote human rights and rule of law in their programs that will help the troops to be better on the ground. The role of think tanks, they will be very useful in developing and publishing analytical products on the causes of violence in different areas, not to have general thinking, but very focused studies on all areas where the phenomenon is ongoing. They also are useful to conduct some thinkings about how to adapt structures, tactics, and even the way of thinking of the military, of the paramilitary, and help to win against insurgency. They have also to think about the ethics, the cost of what operations we are conducting. Are they always justified, and why we should put a lot of resources in what we are doing, and are this operation every time legal, or sometimes they are in contradiction with the laws. There is also an area where Africa is very poor, is the area of doctrine. We don't have a lot of research and publications on doctrine. We borrow from everywhere. It is not bad, but we have also to think and to find doctrines that will be more adapted to our environment. And also, it will be important for think tanks to create the link between the military and the not the philosophers, but the researchers, because usually the military that are on the terrain, they consider that the researchers are dreamers, they are disconnected from the reality, and they just don't look at what they are suggesting. And the researchers also think that the military, they don't think enough, they do everything as they want. So it will be important to create a kind of synergy, experimented militaries that have that were involved in counter-terrorist operations, in counter-insurgency operation, it could be interesting to work with them, to ask them to theorize what their experience, which lesson did they took from what they have carried out on the ground. And also to promote the exchange of best practices and experiences. And that is all I want to say about the role of the think tanks. And I have some bibliography that could be interesting for people that want to dig more in the topic. They are all in French, but the first one was written by a French officer, David Galula, but he wrote it in English. So it could be interesting to have it. Counter-insurgency theory and practice is very interesting. And so I have some of these things. You can maybe Google them and have maybe translation in English. I think, I hope I didn't hurt your ears because my accent is awful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colonel Pui.
Did you raise your hand?
So the floor is open for discussion. Did anybody ask questions, contributions to the presentation by Colonel Pui and Dr. Okereke? Please kindly signify.
Yes, I have some questions for him. I think thank you very much, both of you, for your presentation, which was quite, detailed enough for those of us in the military to sort of understand what's all about. Firstly, I would like to say that CAERT has a lot of work to do. And what I'm saying, for example, is that which you have mentioned, Colonel Pui, is about the issue of doctrine, operational tactics, intelligence and counterintelligence. These are key issues that African militaries must, as a necessity, master, be in charge of before they can defeat any violent conflict in Africa. Number two, we must separate the mandate of the military from paramilitary. And in doing that, we must leave paramilitary to handle anti-terrorism and the military to focus on insurgency. Because, like the case of Nigeria, they are mixing the two together. So the army is all over the place. The police too is all over the place. And there's confusion everywhere. And the safety and the security that they have to provide, they are not providing it. Therefore, there's a problem with our military training institutions. That's a problem. And once we have problems with our military training institutions, I'm not talking about officers alone, I'm talking from the soldiers up. What sort of training are they getting? Leaving that aside, there's also the issue of African militaries now, they are having special forces. What are the special forces doing? Do they know what the special forces are for? And why are they not using them to be able to tackle some of the issues that they face? Which means they train special forces, but they don't know how to use the special forces. The other issue is the organization that the military is using in Africa. They are organized for conventional, symmetric warfare, and they don't want to change. They do not want to change. To me, if they do not change, we continue to have the problem that we have. Because if you look at the case of Congo, for example, how come that the military in Congo, for the past 60 years, they've not been able to contain the violence that's going on in the Congo for 60 years with the UN? And with the UN to create some special forces to be able to help the military there to deal with the violence there. But still, Central African Republic, same story. How come? Mali is going the same way. What can CAERT do with all the military institutions in Africa to be able to change, the training system for us to be able to deal with the issue that we face in Africa? But the one that is key to me is this. And that is the issue of intelligence and counterintelligence. France is in Sahel, but France cannot stay in Sahel without intelligence support from the Americans. They cannot. And that's why Macron has to, agree with Biden in whatever way, so that the Americans continue to provide intelligence. The Americans and the others stop providing intelligence to Nigeria because of counterintelligence problem. Anytime they give intelligence, since 2013, to Nigerian troops, ASWAP and Boko Haram, we know about it. And up to today, they are still ambushing our troops. How come? And it's the same problem in Sahel. It's the same problem in Mali. How do we deal with such issues? And Côte d'Ivoire, I just set up a counter-terrorism center in Côte d'Ivoire with the help of France. We seem to be hopeless without support from abroad. Okay? And every trial that has been done or exercises, it has to be supported from abroad. Even if we cannot do practical exercises, can't we do simulations? Wargaming in a room and try out some of our own doctrine and operational tactics. What can we do? All those things don't cost enough money to do wargaming in Algiers, for example. And I believe these are the issues that we need to look at. Now, coming to the think tanks. We have think tanks all over the place, but how close are they to the military? How close do they work together? They don't in most cases. So if you look at Dr. Gulano today, with his presentation, does he work with the National Defense College of Nigeria or the Armed Forces and Staff College of Nigeria? Does he? And how many think tanks work with CAERT, for example, providing information? And do those think tanks too work on the area of doctrine? As you see in the United States, Canada, and some other places, do they work on doctrine? Do they work on operational tactics system and so on? But so Oriola presented the sociological side of the military, of morale issue. Who's looking at them? Who's taking them serious? But these are serious issues. Now, we tend to want to copy the Americans and the France and so on and so forth. United States has no counterinsurgency in the United States. France has no counterinsurgency in the United States. We don't have anything to copy from them. If not, we should be able to get them to copy from us, like Rwanda is doing in Mozambique. Shortage of resources, yes, in CAERT, with AU-CAERT, but CAERT has got to play more important role. Our military institutions have got to play more important role. And CAERT, military institutions and everybody, they work together and, direct the think tanks on ways and means of being able to help to help them. Thank you very much for your two presentations.
Any other comments or contributions from anybody?
This is the last one for today.
Questions, contributions?
Let them make their own comments.
Would you like to add anything to that? Dr. Okereke,
Hey, come in. Any question?
would you like to say anything to what General has just said?
No, but the points raised by General are well received. They're well received.
Okay,
yes.
Colonel Pui, how about you, sir?
No, that's okay. I don't want to continue struggling in talking in
English.
We really appreciate your efforts, at least in trying to interpret your presentation in English language for most of those of us that are on this call today. So on that note, I thank everybody for your time. I thank all our presenters, the moderators. I thank our hosts. And I want to call today a day. Tomorrow, same time, we'll all be here for the next 4 sessions. And I hope to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you. Mon frère, catch you. Colonel, we're gonna talk. We'll talk later.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good night, sir.
Okay, Adima.
General, sir.
Okay.
Good night, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Long
sir.
time no see your face. Okay.
See you tomorrow, sir.
Yes.
General William, see you tomorrow, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming in.
No
All right,
problem.
sir.
Yes,
Well,
sir.
African Security Affairs.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Okay,
All right.
sir.
See all of you tomorrow. Okay.
Okay, sir. All right.
right.
Yes, sir.
And Cedric, thank you for coming on. Very kind of you.
Yes, sir. And then you had the Ugulano too. Very nice presentation.
Yes, yes. It was a very good presentation.
Hmm.
And all the presentations were, were quite useful. Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
We have a good.
No
Okay.
problem, sir.
Okay, sir. Right.
Bye-bye.
Okay. All right.
Okay, thank you. Tomorrow.